I never planned on going up there alone. Aspen Ridge was one of those places you read about in travel blogs. Off-grid, tucked into the edge of a national forest, no cell signal for miles. It had been my brother Evan's idea originally. We found the listing in 2012 while looking for cheap cabins to rent for a hunting trip. One of those half-baked bonding attempts that brothers do when they're in their 30s and trying to patch over years of silence. But Evan backed out. Work, he said. Always work. And I had already taken time off. So I went. The cabin was about 5 miles off the last paved road in a part of Colorado most tourists never touch. You had to drive a gravel road full of potholes and low-hanging branches, then hike the last half-mile in because the trail got too narrow for a car. The air was thin and clean, and the pine trees pressed in close from both sides like walls. Felt like going into something, not out. The cabin wasn't much, just a square structure of hand-hewn logs with a tin roof that echoed every drop of rain. It had been built in the 60s, maybe earlier. There was a shed out back and a stone chimney with an old Franklin stove inside. A single twin bed, a table with 2 chairs, and a counter with a rust-stained sink. No plumbing. Water came from a hand pump about 30 feet from the back door. There was a composting toilet in a wooden outhouse further down the trail, barely hidden by the trees. I brought enough supplies for a week. Freeze-dried meals, oatmeal packets, canned soup, matches, a lantern, extra propane, a first aid kit, and an emergency radio. I also brought a .308 bolt-action rifle and my Glock 19, both loaded. Not because I expected trouble, just because I like to be ready for it. Bears, maybe, or mountain lions. The first 2 days were quiet. I hiked a bit, chopped some wood, and cooked small meals. The nights were colder than I expected. Even with layers and the stove going, I found myself waking up shivering more than once. On the 3rd night, something changed. It started with a sound, not a dramatic one, just a snap, like a dry twig breaking somewhere behind the cabin. I was reading in my sleeping bag, half asleep, when I heard it. It was too sharp to be wind, too deliberate to be an animal just wandering. I sat up and turned off the lantern. I waited. After a few minutes of silence, I told myself it was nothing. A deer, a raccoon maybe. I laid back down. The next morning I found boot prints. Not mine. They were near the pump, clear in the dry dirt. Not fresh, not muddy, but they're all the same. They pointed toward the cabin, not away. I crouched beside them, ran my finger through the edge of one. They were newer than the ones I made when I got water the day before. I checked the area. No trash disturbed, no marks on the door or windows. I circled around the cabin, looked for more prints, but found none. Just that one spot near the pump. I even walked a little down the trail, thinking maybe someone else had come up here. But there was no one. Stuck in my mind all day. Even when I tried to distract myself with cooking or writing in my journal, I kept replaying it. The angle of the print, how close it was, the silence that followed the night before. I told myself I was being paranoid. I made up an excuse, maybe a hunter passing through. That night I locked the door from the inside, not just with the sliding bolt, but by shoving the table in front of it too. I moved the lantern and stove closer to the middle of the room. I kept the rifle within reach. I didn't sleep. Around midnight I heard the sound again. But this time it wasn't just one twig snapping. It was slower, closer. A crunch of dirt, then another. Footsteps. I turned off the lantern. I laid still, breathing through my mouth. The stove gave off a faint orange glow. I could just barely make out the outline of the door. The footsteps stopped. Then I heard a faint tap. Not loud, just a light knock, like someone pressing their fingers against the wood. I stayed completely still. The knock didn't come again. No voice, no more footsteps. After about an hour, I forced myself to move. I got up slowly, rifle in hand, and stepped toward the door. Nothing. I didn't open it. I didn't even move the table. I sat with my back to the far wall, rifle in my lap, until the light outside began to change and morning bled through the cracks in the walls. When the sun came up fully, I went outside, rifle in hand. The prints were there again. This time they were right outside the door. 2 of them, not just one like before. A set, facing the door. No other tracks. No sign of someone walking away. Just there. I didn't go far that day. Just back and forth to the pump. Every time I opened the door, I looked up and down the trail. Listened. Nothing. On the 5th night, it rained. Hard. I could hear it drumming on the roof like 1,000 tiny hammers. The wind shook the trees, and every sound felt like it might be someone. I didn't light the stove that night. I sat in the dark with the rifle, waiting. And then, sometime after midnight, I heard it again. Not footsteps this time. Breathing. It was faint, but it was real. Slow, steady breathing just outside the wall. Close, like someone standing inches away. I didn't move. My legs were numb. I couldn't see anything in the dark, but I knew the direction of the sound. It was at the window, the one above the counter. I thought about crawling across the floor, slowly, and taking a shot through the wall. But what if I was wrong? What if it was an animal? What if I missed? The breathing stopped after a few minutes. I didn't sleep at all. When morning came, I stepped outside again. Slowly, carefully, I scanned the clearing. I checked the pump. No prints this time. The rain had wiped everything clean. But the fear didn't go away. It just got worse. By now, I was out of ideas. I turned on the emergency radio, tried to find a station. Nothing but static. The weather band worked, though, and it said a cold front was coming in. Snow likely in higher elevations. I decided I was leaving the next day. I packed everything by mid-afternoon. I didn't care about the food I had left. I just wanted to get out before night came. But then I stopped myself. If someone was really out there, watching, waiting, they'd see me leaving. They might follow me. There were 5 miles of road before I hit anything paved. Then another 20 to the nearest gas station. So I waited for nightfall again. This time I kept all the lights on. I didn't care if they saw me inside. I wanted them to know I was still armed. I kept the rifle and Glock on the table. I stood by the door most of the night, looking out the window through the cracked blinds. Nothing came. Around 4 a.m., I opened the door slowly. The cold hit me like a slap. I stepped outside and stood for a long time in the dark. No movement, no sounds, no breathing. I left the cabin just after dawn. I moved fast, too fast. The trail was slick with frost, and I slipped twice. My knee was bleeding by the time I reached the truck. But I didn't stop. I threw the gear in the back and didn't look behind me until I was halfway down the gravel road. No one followed. Took me hours to feel normal again. When I reached the highway, I pulled over at a diner and sat inside for a long time, just breathing warm air and listening to other people talk. Real people. I didn't go home right away. I drove to a friend's place 3 towns over and stayed there for the night. Weeks passed before I talked about it. I never filed a report. What would I say? That someone walked around my cabin at night? That I thought I heard breathing? There were no cameras, no cell signal, no proof. I didn't even have the boot prints. They were long gone under the rain and snow. But here's the part one can't forget. A month after I got home, I got an envelope in the mail. No return address. Inside was a photo of me, taken from behind. I was carrying my pack down the trail, right before the last bend where the cabin goes out of sight. The photo was printed on thick, glossy paper, like the kind you get from a drugstore. No note, nothing else. I burned it in the sink. I didn't sleep that night either. I've never been back to Aspen Ridge. I sold the cabin to a couple from Denver who wanted to get away from it all. I didn't tell them anything. They didn't ask. But sometimes I think about it. About the footsteps, the knock, the breathing, and I wonder how long he was watching me before I ever knew he was there. It was February 1996 when I decided to get away for a while. I was 32, living in Denver, going through one of those quiet personal collapses people rarely notice until it's too late. The kind that starts with a few missed calls, stretches into weeks of ignoring emails, and settles into a numb kind of isolation that doesn't even feel bad anymore. It just is. I'd been laid off from my job at a publishing company 2 months earlier. They called it downsizing, but I knew better. I wasn't sleeping much, wasn't eating right either. I'd wake up late, lie around all day, maybe watch TV if I could bear the sound. I told myself I just needed time. Space. My older cousin Mark had a cabin up near Pagosa Springs. It was an old family place we used to visit in the summers when we were kids. The kind of spot that clung to your memory like a pine scent. Wood floors that creaked even when nobody moved. Screen doors that never quite latched. And the smell of burnt coffee always lingering no matter how long it had been empty. Mark hadn't used it in years. When I asked him if I could spend a few weeks there, he didn't hesitate. "All yours," he said. "Just make sure to bring enough food. And watch for snow. That place buries easy in February." I packed up my 1989 Subaru and left the next morning. I brought everything I thought I might need. Canned food, dry goods, bottled water, a stack of books, a little propane heater, and a few blankets. The cabin didn't have running water anymore, or electricity for that matter. It had been off the grid before that was a trendy phrase. The drive took most of the day. Long stretches of silence through pine-covered hills, only broken by the occasional snowplow passing the other way. By the time I turned off the highway onto the narrow forest road, the sun was dipping behind the trees. The air turned sharp and dry, and my ears popped with the change in elevation. My tires crunched slowly over the snow-covered gravel as I made my way toward Bent Pine Cabin. The place looked just like I remembered, tilted slightly to one side, as if it had been exhaling for decades. It was tucked between tall trees with thick branches that looked like black veins against the sky. The steps groaned under my boots as I climbed the porch. The key was still hidden under the third rock in the planter, just like Mark said. Inside, it was colder than outside. The smell hit me right away. Stale wood, old dust, and something slightly sour. I unpacked, lit a few candles, and set up the heater near the old recliner in the corner. I didn't bother exploring much that night. I was exhausted. I unrolled my sleeping bag right there in the living room and dozed off, listening to the wind brush against the windows. The first few days passed like I'd hoped. Slow, quiet. I read, made small meals, and wrote in a notebook I'd brought. There was something calming about the way the cold settled into your bones and made everything else seem less important. I kept the heater running low during the day, bundled up at night. Every morning I shoveled a little path to the outhouse in the back, a grim ritual that reminded me how far I was from city life. By the fifth day, a storm rolled in. It started with a whisper, light flurries brushing the window like ash. But by evening, it had swallowed the forest whole. The trees became shadows. Snow piled against the windowsills like waves. I watched it for hours, wrapped in a blanket, sipping lukewarm soup from a mug. I wasn't scared. Not then. It felt like exactly what I wanted, pure, uninterrupted silence. But the storm didn't stop. The next morning, the path to the outhouse had vanished. The drifts came up to my knees, even higher in some places. I shoveled for over an hour just to dig myself out the front door. My back ached. My hands throbbed. I knew I had enough food for at least another week, but the thought of being snowed in for too long unsettled me. On the seventh day, I noticed the footprints. I was standing on the porch, trying to light a cigarette in the wind when I saw them. Just off to the side, near the treeline, faint impressions in the snow. Not boot prints, not animal tracks either. These were bare feet, human, toes and everything. About the size of a child's, but the stride was wrong. Too far apart, almost like someone had been running. They stopped about 30 feet from the cabin. I stared at them for a long time, the cigarette burning down in my fingers, not even noticing. I told myself they were old, leftover, maybe from before the last storm. Maybe they weren't even what they looked like. Shadows, maybe, melting patterns, anything else. That night I didn't sleep. The next morning, the prints were gone, buried under fresh snow. I walked out anyway, circled the cabin with a shovel, looking for signs of animals. Nothing. No scratches on the walls, no disturbances in the snow beyond my own tracks. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching. On day 9, I woke up to find the door open. Not wide, just cracked. An inch, maybe 2. Enough to let in the cold. I knew I had locked it the night before, I double-checked the windows too. All of them were shut tight. Nothing stolen. Nothing broken. I sat on the floor for over an hour, staring at that door, wondering if I'd made a mistake. Maybe I was losing my mind out here. I started writing more, trying to get the thoughts out of my head and onto paper. I jotted down everything. What I ate, what time I woke up, the temperature. It made me feel grounded. Then the noises started. First it was soft, scraping sounds on the side of the cabin at night. Once or twice I heard what sounded like crunching snow just outside the window. But every time I looked, there was nothing. I convinced myself it was animals. Deer maybe, or branches rubbing against the walls. That made sense. But then something changed. On day 12, I woke up to find all my canned food lined up on the floor. Every single can taken out of the box and placed in a perfect row. I hadn't done that. I knew I hadn't. My hands shook as I put them back. I didn't know what to do, so I boarded up the windows, just the lower halves. I didn't want to be seen, or maybe I didn't want to see. That night, I didn't sleep at all. I sat in the recliner with the heater next to me, the hatchet from the woodpile in my lap. Hours passed. I kept listening. Every little creak, every gust of wind felt louder than it should have. Around 3 a.m., I heard something or someone move past the window. A shuffle. Not fast, just steady, slow. I didn't look, couldn't. The next morning, I found the front door scratched. 5 long gouges down the center, like someone had dragged nails or claws or a knife across it. I checked my supplies. Nothing missing. The heater was still working, but the propane was low. I had maybe 2 days left of fuel. That was when I started planning my exit. The road out was buried. I knew the Subaru wouldn't make it. Even with chains on the tires, the snow was too deep. I would have to walk. It was about 4 miles back to the main road. Maybe another hour to the nearest ranger station if I followed the trail. I packed light, only what I could carry. Water, a flashlight, a flare gun I found in the closet, and the hatchet. I set out early the next morning. The cold hit me like a wall. It was hard to breathe, even harder to move through the snow. I didn't make it far, maybe a mile. Then I heard it, branches breaking behind me. Fast, heavy. I turned, heart pounding, but saw nothing. Still, I ran. I didn't stop until my lungs burned and my legs gave out. When I looked up, I realized I had gotten turned around. I wasn't heading toward the road. I was heading deeper into the woods. By the time I made it back to the cabin, it was almost dark. I collapsed on the porch. My feet were frozen, my fingers numb. I dropped the hatchet somewhere. I never found it. That night, I slept with the flare gun in my hand. The final morning, I woke up to silence. Thick, unnatural silence. No wind, no movement. I got up and looked outside. Footprints, hundreds of them, surrounding the cabin in every direction, like someone had been pacing for hours. Bare feet, different sizes, some small, some larger, but all human. I didn't understand how that was possible. I didn't want to understand. I didn't even try to leave that day. I just waited. When night fell, I kept every light on. Sat in the corner, heart racing, eyes fixed on the door. I don't remember falling asleep, but I must have, because when I opened my eyes, it was morning. Bright, calm. Everything was gone. No footprints, no scratches, no sounds, just snow. I didn't waste time. I packed up, left the rest, and started walking. This time, I didn't stop. After 5 hours, I reached the road. A snowplow found me around noon. The driver said I looked like I'd seen a ghost. I told him I'd been camping, got lost, nothing more. I didn't tell anyone about the prints, or the scratches, or the food, because I knew what they'd say. I'd say the same thing if I heard it from someone else. It was the winter of 2013 when I decided to get away from everything, just for a weekend. A break from the constant noise, the endless rush of the city. A chance to reconnect with myself, away from the hustle of daily life. I wasn't sure what I needed more, solitude or silence. Maybe both. So, I rented a small, remote cabin tucked in the hills of southern Indiana. A place far enough to not hear anything but the occasional bird or rustling tree, with no neighbors for miles. I drove the 3-hour stretch from the city to the cabin alone. The weather had turned bitter cold, a harsh reminder that winter was already deep in its grasp. The last few miles were a winding dirt road, barely wide enough for my car to squeeze through. It was a relief when I finally saw the cabin, a simple single-story structure made of weathered wood. Its chimney puffed out a thin stream of smoke, which meant the fireplace inside was already lit. Good. I wasn't sure how well the heating worked, but I knew I'd appreciate the warmth. I parked the car, grabbed my bag, and made my way to the door. The snow crunched under my boots with each step. The sky was overcast, a dull gray blanket stretched above, making the whole world feel a little closed in. It was almost peaceful, if not for the strange unease that settled over me the moment I stepped onto the porch. It wasn't anything specific, but something about the silence, the way the wind only whispered through the trees. It felt off. It wasn't the kind of quiet that made you feel at ease. It felt like something was watching, waiting. I shook it off. I wasn't here to entertain paranoid thoughts. I turned the doorknob, the wood creaked, and the door swung open. The smell hit me immediately. Wood, dust, and something musty, like it hadn't been used in a long time, but it was warm inside. A fire crackled in the stone fireplace, casting flickering shadows against the walls. There was a couch facing it, a small kitchen area in the corner, and a table by the window. The place was simple, almost too simple. There wasn't much decoration, just the basics. A bed in the back room, a few shelves with old books, a couple of plates and mugs scattered around. It was cozy, sure, but it felt more like a place built to survive rather than thrive. I set my bag down on the kitchen table, feeling a little more at ease now that I was inside. I went to the window to take a look outside. The snow was coming down heavier now, covering the ground with a fresh layer of white. I could barely make out the road from here. The cabin was even more isolated than I had expected. It didn't take long for the fire to start warming the room, and soon enough, I was shedding my coat, sitting down with a hot cup of tea, and listening to the crackling logs. The first few hours were just as I'd imagined, peaceful, quiet, and serene. I read a little, looked outside every now and then, and let the warmth of the fire settle my thoughts. But then, as night began to fall, I noticed something odd. The cabin, despite its isolation, felt unsettled. It wasn't the noise of the outside world, or the lack of it, that bothered me. It was the silence. The deeper the night got, the more oppressive it became. I wasn't sure how to explain it, but I felt like I was being watched, like something or someone was out there, just beyond the reach of my sight. I told myself it was just my imagination running wild. But every time I glanced toward the window, the feeling didn't go away. Around midnight, the unease had grown enough that I decided to call it a night. I didn't want to feel like I had wasted my time away, so I turned off the lights, climbed into bed, and tried to sleep. The bed creaked under my weight. The blanket was thick and heavy. It was the kind of warmth that made you want to bury yourself in it and never leave. But even under the blankets, I couldn't shake the feeling. I kept telling myself I was being stupid, that it was just the isolation playing tricks on my mind, but the feeling didn't fade. I had just started to drift off when I heard it, the faint sound of a knock, a soft, almost imperceptible tap against the cabin's wooden frame. I froze. My heart skipped a beat. It was so faint that I thought I might have imagined it. But then it came again. A light tap, tap, tap. My mind raced. Who could be out there? The nearest neighbor was miles away. I got out of bed, my feet touching the cold floor. The wind outside was howling now, rattling the windows and sending a chill through the cabin. The tapping continued, steady, persistent. I walked cautiously to the door. Should I open it? Should I check? Every instinct told me not to, but curiosity was stronger. I grabbed the handle and slowly pulled the door open just enough to peek outside. Nothing. The night was still, the snow falling in thick, swirling flakes. No one was there. The porch light flickered weakly in the distance, casting long shadows over the snow. I stepped out onto the porch, looking left and right, expecting to see something, someone, but there was nothing. I locked the door behind me and stood there for a moment, trying to make sense of what had just happened. I should have felt relieved, but the sense of dread lingered. Maybe it was an animal, I thought. Maybe it was a branch tapping against the wood. I shook my head, telling myself I was being ridiculous. Still, the feeling didn't go away. I stood out there for a while longer, just trying to convince myself to relax. But it was no use. Something felt off. Something about this cabin, this place, just didn't sit right with me. The rest of the night was restless. I barely slept, the wind outside whistling through the trees, every creak of the cabin echoing in my ears. I kept glancing at the window, half expecting to see someone standing there, watching me. But the night passed without any more incidents. By the time morning came, I was exhausted but determined to make the most of the day. I couldn't let one weird night ruin my entire trip. I spent the next few hours exploring the area around the cabin. It was breathtaking. Snow-covered hills, dense woods, the kind of untouched beauty you rarely get to experience. The morning light, though pale and weak, made the landscape feel almost ethereal. I even walked down a small trail that led toward a frozen creek, the ice thick enough to hold my weight. There was a part of me that was starting to relax again, a part that was telling me that maybe I had just been imagining things the night before. But as I walked back toward the cabin, something caught my eye. Off in the distance, by the edge of the trees, there was something or someone standing there. It was too far to make out details, but I could see the outline of a person. My breath caught in my throat. This wasn't part of my imagination. I stood frozen, my heart racing. The figure didn't move, didn't acknowledge me in any way. It was just there, standing perfectly still, blending in with the shadows of the forest. I was sure it was a person, but who would be out there, in the middle of nowhere, in the dead of winter? I didn't wait to find out. I turned and ran back to the cabin, my footsteps quick and heavy in the snow. I burst through the door, locked it behind me, and slid down the wall, my heart pounding in my chest. I wanted to call the authorities, but I had no phone service out here. I felt trapped, stuck in this place, with no way to reach out to anyone. What if they were out there watching me? What if they were planning to come inside? For the rest of the day, I stayed inside. I kept the curtains drawn, the doors locked, and every sound outside felt like it was something moving, something waiting. The quiet that I had sought when I first arrived now felt like a heavy weight. I didn't know what was happening, but I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't alone in these woods. As night fell again, I had to make a choice. I could stay and possibly face whatever was out there, or I could leave. I grabbed my bag, packed everything into my car, and drove off into the dark. The headlights cut through the thick snowfall, but I didn't look back. By the time I got back to the city, I felt like I had just woken up from a nightmare. My mind was racing, trying to piece together everything that had happened. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized that I would never know the truth. And that's what haunted me the most. The feeling of being watched, of being so close to something that I couldn't understand, was something I would carry with me forever. I may have left the cabin, but it was clear. The cabin never truly left me. I had always thought I was immune to the fear that stories of old cabins or isolated homes stirred in other people. I'd read the books, watched the documentaries, and laughed at the tales of eerie woods and darkened windows. But all that changed when I found myself staying alone in that cabin. It wasn't supposed to be a big deal. I was 29, just looking for a weekend of peace and solitude, something to clear my head. I had been through a tough time recently, broken up with my girlfriend of 4 years, quit a job I hated, and felt more lost than I ever had in my life. So when I saw the listing for the cabin in the middle of nowhere, I jumped at the chance. The place was nestled in a quiet part of the Appalachian Mountains, about 3 hours from where I lived in Tennessee. The pictures on the website looked like something out of a hiking magazine. A small, rustic log cabin with a wood-burning stove, a simple kitchen, a porch that overlooked a wide valley and thick woods surrounding it on every side. There was no mention of neighbors or anything that could disturb my peace. The listing was simple, just a photo of the cabin with a description that promised total isolation. Perfect, I thought, just what I needed. I arrived on a Friday afternoon, the sun still high and shining. The long gravel road leading to the cabin was surrounded by dense trees, the kind that seemed to stretch endlessly into the horizon. The only sounds were the crunching of the gravel beneath my tires and the occasional rustle of branches. No other cars, no people, just nature, just what I wanted. The cabin itself was smaller than I imagined. It was a single story with an old wooden deck that creaked underfoot. The door had a tarnished brass handle, and when I turned it, it opened with a groan, as if it hadn't been used in years. Inside, it was exactly what I expected, cozy, but worn. A small fireplace with a stack of logs in the corner, a couple of chairs and a small wooden table, and an old rug that had clearly seen better days. I took a moment to breathe in the quiet. There was something strange about it, though almost oppressive, but I figured it was just the unfamiliarity of the place. I unloaded my bags, found a few books on the shelf, and settled in. The first night was peaceful. The fire crackled in the hearth, and I had no trouble falling asleep in the silence. For a brief moment, I felt at peace, but that peace didn't last. The next morning, I woke up to a strange noise. It was faint at first, a sort of scratching sound, but I couldn't place it. It wasn't the wind, there was no wind. It wasn't an animal either, as I had heard nothing outside. I sat up in bed, listening, trying to figure out where it was coming from. It sounded like it was coming from underneath the floor, almost like something was moving under the cabin. I shook my head, trying to dismiss the thought. There were no other people here. The cabin was isolated. I had just imagined it. Still, I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling. I decided to go for a walk in the woods. I needed to get my mind off the noise and remind myself that I was alone, in control. So, I grabbed a jacket, left the cabin, and started walking down the path that wound into the trees. The woods were dense, but the trail was clear, and I made good time. It wasn't a long hike, maybe an hour or so, but it was enough to calm my nerves. The birds chirped, and I saw a few deer in the distance. The sun was bright, and everything felt normal again. When I got back to the cabin, I found the front door wide open. I froze for a moment, trying to process what I was seeing. I had locked the door when I left. There was no way it had blown open by itself. I approached cautiously, my heart racing. The door wasn't just cracked open. It was wide open, swinging slightly in the breeze. I stepped inside. The cabin was just as I had left it. Nothing disturbed, nothing out of place. But that didn't make sense. I hadn't heard anything while I was outside. No footsteps, no sounds of someone moving around. I walked through the small rooms, checking the windows, the back door. It was locked. Everything was secure. Still, the feeling of unease hung over me. I couldn't shake the sensation that someone had been here, that someone was still here. I decided to take a shower, trying to relax, but the strange feeling only grew stronger. The scratching noise from earlier was back, more distinct this time, like something was scraping against the wood beneath my feet. I stood in the shower, listening, but when I stepped out, it was gone. That night, I decided to stay in. I made a fire, poured myself a drink, and settled into the armchair by the hearth. The warmth from the flames was comforting, but I couldn't stop glancing toward the door. It was locked. I had checked it at least 5 times, but I kept thinking I heard something outside. Footsteps? A rustling? I wasn't sure. The whole night passed without any major incident, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. By the next morning, I had decided I would pack up and leave. I couldn't explain why, but I knew I didn't want to stay another night in that cabin. I packed my bags quickly, determined to get out of there as soon as possible. But as I loaded my car, I glanced at the woods once more, and something caught my eye. There, just at the edge of the trees, I saw a figure. I froze. It was a man, or at least I thought it was. He stood still, watching me, his face partially obscured by the shadows. My heart raced, and I reached for my phone, but as soon as I looked back, he was gone. There was no movement, no sign of anyone, just the same empty trees. I couldn't get out of there fast enough. I drove away from the cabin, down the gravel road, heart pounding in my chest. When I finally reached the main highway, I pulled over to collect myself. My hands were shaking, my thoughts scattered. I still didn't understand what had happened or who that man was, but I didn't care. I just needed to get home. The drive back was uneventful. As I entered the city, the normal sounds of traffic and people helped calm my nerves. I was nearly home when I received a message from the cabin's owner. It was a simple text, nothing unusual. Just wanted to make sure everything was okay. Hope you had a good stay. Let me know if you found everything all right. I paused before responding. How could I tell him the truth? That I had felt watched? That something didn't feel right? That the door had been wide open when I came back? I didn't respond. Instead, I just deleted the message. Whatever had happened there, I didn't need to talk about it. All I knew was that the next time I needed peace, I'd find it somewhere else. The trees loom over the narrow dirt road, their branches clawing at the roof of my car like skeletal fingers. It's October 1998, and the air is thick with the smell of damp earth and rotting leaves. My headlights cut through the darkness, but not far enough. The road is barely visible, swallowed by the forest. I check the map again, but the paper is crumpled, the ink smudged from the rain earlier. My cousin Mark said the cabin was secluded, peaceful, a good place to clear my head after everything that happened back in the city. But now, as the road gets rougher and the trees press in closer, I wonder if this was a mistake. The car jerks as the tires hit a deep rut. The steering wheel twists in my hands, and for a second, I think I'm going off the road. But then the tires catch and I keep moving. My fingers tighten on the wheel. The dashboard clock reads 11:37 p.m. I've been driving for hours. Finally, a break in the trees. A wooden sign, half-rotted, leans to the side. Black pine cabin 1 mile. The letters are faded, barely legible. I swallow hard and keep driving. The cabin comes into view slowly, like it's emerging from the darkness itself. It's smaller than I expected, just one story with a slanted roof covered in moss. The logs are dark with age, the windows black and empty. There's no light inside, no sign that anyone has been here in years. I kill the engine. The silence is immediate, pressing in from all sides. No crickets, no wind, nothing. Just the slow, steady thump of my own heartbeat in my ears. I grab my bag from the passenger seat and step out. The ground is soft, wet leaves sticking to my boots. The air is colder here, like the trees are holding in the chill. I walk toward the cabin, my breath fogging in front of me. The key Mark gave me is cold in my hand. The lock is stiff, but after a few tries, the door creaks open. The smell hits me first. Damp wood, mildew, something faintly sour underneath. I fumble for the light switch, but when I flip it, nothing happens. Of course, no power. I pull out my flashlight and sweep the beam across the room. Dust floats in the air, stirred by my movement. The floorboards groan under my weight. There's a couch, a wood stove, a small kitchenette with an old propane stove. A door leads to what must be the bedroom. I set my bag down and try to ignore the unease crawling up my spine. It's just an old cabin, nothing to be afraid of. But then I hear it, a soft creak from outside. I freeze. The sound wasn't from the cabin, it was from the porch, like someone or something just stepped onto the wood. I hold my breath, listening. For a long moment, there's nothing. Then another creak, closer this time. My pulse spikes. I turn off the flashlight, plunging the room into darkness. My hands shake as I crouch low, moving toward the window. The glass is grimy, but I can see outside. First, nothing. Just trees swaying slightly in the night. Then movement. A shadow detaches itself from the darkness near the edge of the porch. Tall, broad-shouldered, standing perfectly still, watching the cabin. I duck down, my heart hammering. Who the hell is out there? Mark said no one else would be around for miles. Another creak. The shadow moves closer. I can hear slow, deliberate footsteps now. Heavy, purposeful. I look around frantically. The cabin has no phone, no weapons. Just me and the dark. The footsteps stop right outside the door. I press myself against the wall, barely breathing. The doorknob rattles. Then silence. A full minute passes. Maybe 2. My legs ache from staying so still. Then, a loud thud against the door. I jump, biting back a gasp. The door shakes in its frame. Another thud. Then another. Whoever, whatever, is out there is trying to break in. I stumble backward, my mind racing. The bedroom. There's a window in there. Maybe I can get out. I move fast, keeping low. The bedroom door is already slightly open. I slip inside and shut it quietly behind me. The window is small, but I can fit. I yank it open, the hinges squealing. Cold air rushes in. I don't hesitate. I climb out, dropping onto the wet ground below. The forest is pitch black. I don't stop to think. I just run. Branches whip at my face as I crash through the underbrush. My boots sink into mud, but I keep moving. Behind me, I hear the cabin door slam open. Heavy footsteps follow. Faster. I don't look back. The trees blur together. My lungs burn. Then headlights. A road. I burst out of the trees and onto the pavement, waving my arms wildly. A truck screeches to a stop. The driver rolls down his window, eyes wide. What the hell? Please, I gasp. Someone's after me. The man doesn't ask questions. He unlocks the door, and I scramble inside. As we speed away, I look back. The forest is still, empty, but I know what I saw, and I'm never going back. Epilogue: the police found nothing. No signs of forced entry.
No footprints.
Nothing. Mark insisted I must have imagined it. Too much stress, he said. Too much time alone in the dark. But I know better, because 2 nights later, I woke up to the sound of my apartment door creaking open, and heavy footsteps in the hall. The cabin wasn't much, just a small, wooden thing tucked between thick pines, far enough from town that no one would hear you scream. Not that I expected to scream. I came here to get away from everything. The noise, the people, the constant buzzing of my phone. Just me, the trees, and the quiet. I arrived just before sunset. The air was sharp with the smell of pine and damp earth. The key was under a mossy rock near the front steps, just like the rental listing said. The door creaked when I pushed it open, the sound too loud in the silence. Inside, it was musty, like no one had been here in years. Dust floated in the thin beams of light cutting through the grimy windows. I dropped my bag on the couch, sending up a puff of dust. The place had a kitchenette, a wood stove, a sagging bed in the corner. No electricity, just an old oil lamp on the table. I lit it, the flame flickering shadows across the walls. Night came fast. The trees outside swallowed the last of the light, and the cabin got darker, smaller. I ate a cold sandwich from my bag, listening to the wind push against the walls. It sounded like whispers. I told myself it was just the trees. Then I heard the footsteps. At first, I thought it was the cabin settling. Old places make noise, but this was different, slow, deliberate steps circling outside. Not an animal. Too heavy. Too human. I froze, my breath stuck in my throat. The lamp flickered, making the shadows jump. The steps stopped near the door. Silence. Then a scrape, like something dragging against the wood. I didn't move, didn't breathe, My heart pounded so hard I could feel it in my fingertips. The doorknob turned. It rattled just once, then stopped. I waited. Nothing. Then, bang, a fist against the door. Hard. The whole frame shook. I stumbled back, knocking over the lamp. The flame died, plunging me into darkness. Another bang. Then another. The door groaned under the weight of whatever was outside. I fumbled for my bag, my hands shaking. My fingers closed around my pocket knife. It was small, barely 3 inches, but it was all I had. The banging stopped. Silence again. I strained to hear, my ears aching from the effort. Then a new sound, scratching. Slow, methodical, like someone running nails along the window beside the door. I couldn't see anything. The curtains were drawn, but I knew something was out there, watching, waiting. The scratching stopped. A minute passed, then another. I let out a breath, my body trembling. Maybe they left. Then, crash, The window shattered. Glass sprayed across the floor. Cold air rushed in, carrying the smell of wet leaves and something else. Something metallic. Blood. I bolted for the back door, my legs weak with fear. I yanked it open and sprinted into the trees. Branches whipped at my face, my arms. I didn't stop, didn't look back. Behind me, footsteps pounded the earth. Fast. Close. I ran until my lungs burned, until the cabin was far behind me, until I tripped over roots and fell face first into the mud. I scrambled up, turning nothing. The woods were silent, empty. I stood there, gasping, my whole body shaking. Then I saw it. Between the trees, barely visible in the moonlight, a figure, tall, still, just watching. I ran again. I don't know how long I ran. Hours, maybe. My feet were numb, my clothes torn. When I finally saw the glow of town lights, I nearly cried. I didn't stop until I reached the gas station on the edge of town. The clerk took one look at me and called the cops. They found the cabin empty. No signs of forced entry. No broken window. But I know what I heard, what I saw. And I know one thing for sure. I wasn't alone out there. Someone or something was with me, and it's still out there. I was 34 the year I took a break from the city. My name's Thomas Keene. I had just quit a job I held for 9 years at a small architecture firm in Milwaukee. I don't regret leaving. The job paid well, but it hollowed me out. Late nights, endless emails, client revisions that went nowhere. I was worn down, burnt out. When I walked out that glass door on May 2nd, 2021, I told myself I'd take one summer off before thinking about what came next. My uncle had a place out in the Northwoods of Wisconsin, tucked far back in the trees off a long gravel stretch called Old Mendon Road. You wouldn't find it on any regular map. The cabin had no running water, no internet, and only the faintest whisper of cell signal if you stood on the porch and held your phone above your head. It was built in the 70s, cedar logs and a green tin roof, 1 bedroom with stove, and a screened-in porch that faced a still, dark lake that locals called Long Hollow. He told me I could stay as long as I wanted, so long as I locked up when I left and made sure the place didn't fall apart. I left Milwaukee early on a Tuesday morning. My car, a 2008 Subaru Forester with 180,000 miles, was packed with canned food, bottled water, tools, a first aid kit, and more books than I could probably read in 3 summers. The drive took nearly 5 hours. It was all highways until the last stretch, where I turned onto a county road that gradually thinned from pavement to gravel. The trees grew thicker the deeper I went. Pines, birch, oak, branches bending low like they were watching. There were no houses, no signs, just road and forest. By the time I reached the cabin, it was past noon. The place looked exactly how I remembered it from my last visit 6 years before. There was moss growing along the base of the walls, and the grass had swallowed the path to the lake. But it felt safe, even a little inviting. I unlocked the door, stepped inside, and the smell hit me. Old wood, dried pine needles, and the faintest hint of mold. I didn't mind it. It smelled like solitude. The first few days were peaceful. I settled into a rhythm, woke with the sun, read for hours, walked down to the lake to fish, though I never caught anything worth keeping, then made simple meals on the propane stove. Nights were still and quiet, just the sound of loons across the water or the occasional rustling of something in the underbrush. I wrote a little in an old notebook. Not anything serious, just thoughts, memories, half-done sketches of things I saw. It was maybe the 4th or 5th night when things started to feel off. I woke up around 2 a.m., no clear reason. The room was pitch black. I didn't hear anything at first, just the usual hum of insects outside. But then I noticed something subtle, the kind of silence that isn't silence at all. Like the world was holding its breath. No frogs, no wind, just stillness. I stayed in bed, eyes wide, ears straining. I figured maybe it was a bear or a coyote passing through. The woods were full of animals. But then I heard a sound I couldn't place, soft, steady, like 2 quick taps against the side of the cabin. Not loud, not forceful, almost like knuckles on wood. I told myself it was just the wind, or maybe an animal brushing against the siding. I stayed in bed, heart beating a little faster than I liked. Eventually, I fell asleep. The next morning, I stepped outside and looked around. There were no tracks. Nothing moved in the trees. I walked the perimeter of the cabin, checking for damage. One of the side walls had 2 faint marks, small smudges near waist height. Not scratches, not dirt, just marks. They could have been from anything. I didn't dwell on it, but that wasn't the end of it. Over the next week, things started happening with more frequency. Sometimes it was small objects moved slightly from where I left them. A book I'd left on the arm of the chair was suddenly on the floor. A tin can that had been on the counter now lay on the table. I told myself I was just forgetful. Maybe I bumped them without noticing. Then came the footprints. It rained one night, a heavy summer downpour that washed everything clean. I stepped out the next morning and noticed boot prints leading from the tree line to the cabin porch. Just one set, deep impressions. Standard hiking boots, size 11 or 12. My boots were old and worn, with a different tread entirely. These were newer. I stared at them for a long time, unsure what to think. Someone had come close during the night, but I'd heard nothing. No car, no voice, not even the creak of the wooden steps. I followed the prints back into the trees, but they vanished after maybe 20 feet. The ground was rocky, the grass tall. No way to track beyond that. That afternoon, I walked 2 miles up the road to a spot where I sometimes got enough signal to send texts. I messaged my uncle to ask if anyone else had access to the cabin. He replied a few hours later, *nope, just you. Nobody's been up there since last fall. You okay? I told him I was fine. I didn't want to sound paranoid. That night, I stayed up late. I kept the lights off, sat near the window and listened. Around 1:40 a.m., I heard movement outside. Soft steps, not animal sounds, more deliberate. I stood up and peered through the glass, trying not to breathe too loud. A figure stood near the edge of the trees. Couldn't make out much. No light, just a silhouette, tall, wearing something dark. They didn't move for a long time. Then they turned and walked back into the woods. I stayed up the rest of the night with a hatchet in my lap. By morning, I convinced myself it was just a hunter, maybe someone camping nearby who got turned around. The rationalizations helped, but only for a little while. I started making noise during the day, hiked more, made myself visible. I figured if someone was watching, they'd see I wasn't some lost tourist. I hoped they'd leave me alone. Then the notes started. The first one was tucked under a rock by the fire pit. Just a scrap of paper folded in half. No envelope. I opened it. The handwriting was stiff and blocky. You shouldn't be here. That was it. I scanned the woods, heart racing. Nothing. Just trees. Just shadows. I packed a bag that night and considered leaving. But I didn't want to be chased out of a place that was supposed to be peaceful. I told myself maybe it was a prank. Locals trying to scare me off. I locked the doors, kept the hatchet close. The second note came 2 days later. This one was left on the porch, tucked under the screen door. Asterisk still here. Why? Asterisk. I didn't sleep that night. I stopped walking to the signal spot. No more texts. No more books. I spent most of the day near the cabin. Alert. Listening. Waiting. Then one night, the door handle jiggled. It was around 3 a.m. I was on the floor in the living room, flashlight off, barely breathing. I heard it metal on metal, someone testing the lock. Then footsteps around the side. Soft taps on the window glass. Not forceful, just testing. Waiting. I stayed absolutely still. Whoever it was didn't try to break in. Just walked the perimeter, tapping once or twice, then disappearing again into the dark. At dawn, I opened the door and found a third note pinned to the wood with a nail. Leave now. I packed everything that morning. I didn't care how it looked. I threw my gear into the car, locked the cabin behind me, and sped down Old Mendon Road, tires spitting gravel. I didn't stop until I hit pavement. I didn't go straight home. I booked a cheap motel off the highway and stayed there for the night. I kept the curtains closed and the lights low. Slept with a chair jammed against the door. The next day, I called my uncle. I told him everything. The notes, the sounds, the figure, the jiggling door. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said something that stuck with me. Asterisk, 20 years ago, there was a guy who went missing near Long Hollow. Lived out there by himself. Trapper or something. Never found him. Just his boots. People figured he drowned or got lost in the woods. But maybe... Asterisk. He trailed off. I could tell he didn't want to finish the sentence. I haven't been back to the cabin since. My uncle still owns it, but last I heard, he hasn't gone up there in over a year. The place is probably falling apart by now, weeds swallowing the porch, shutters rotting in the rain. Sometimes I think about going back, just to see, to prove to myself it wasn't as bad as I remember. But then I think about that last note, the way it was nailed into the door, the calmness of it, like whoever wrote it wasn't angry, just waiting. I don't scare easy, but the idea that someone could be out there, just watching, always silent, always close, that still gets to me. It wasn't a ghost. It wasn't a monster. It was worse. It was real. It had been a long drive to get to the cabin, a 2-day trek through winding roads and endless stretches of forest. My brother, Evan, and I had decided to escape the noise of the city for a weekend of isolation. No cell service, no distractions. Just the two of us, the woods, and the cabin that had been in our family for generations. The cabin was located deep in the woods, far from any signs of civilization. I had only been there a few times as a kid, and even then, the place had always seemed a bit off. The wood creaked, the walls sagged, and the air smelled like old pine and something else, something I couldn't place. But I didn't think much of it. I was used to the outdoors, or at least I thought I was. Evan, who was 4 years older than me, was always the adventurous one, the one who pushed boundaries and convinced me to do things I normally wouldn't. As kids, he was the reason I went rock climbing for the first time, and he was also the one who dragged me into the woods when we weren't supposed to be there. Now, as adults, it was the same thing. He had insisted we take the trip, claiming it would be good for us, a way to get away from everything. "We need this, man," he'd said as we packed up the car in the driveway. "It's not like we have anything better to do." I didn't argue. He was right about that. Life had been chaotic, and I wasn't exactly looking forward to dealing with it anymore. So here we were, a couple of hours from the nearest town, with nothing but trees surrounding us. By the time we reached the cabin, the sun had already begun to set, casting long shadows across the forest floor. The sky was a darkening blue, the first stars beginning to appear. The air was cool and crisp, the kind of cool that made you feel like you were breathing something cleaner than city air. The cabin was exactly as I remembered it. Small, run down, and weather-beaten. It looked like it hadn't been touched in years, even though we made the trip here every few years to check on it. The porch sagged in places, and the roof was covered with patches of moss. There was a fire pit in the front yard, the stone walls chipped and cracked from years of use. To most, it would have looked like an eyesore, but to me, it was familiar. We pulled up to the front, and Evan got out immediately, stretching his arms above his head. "Home sweet home," he said, walking towards the cabin. I stayed behind for a moment, taking in the scene. The forest seemed different now somehow. The trees were thicker, the darkness deeper. I couldn't help but feel the weight of the silence pressing down on me. It wasn't the peaceful kind of silence either. It felt heavy, like something was waiting just outside of sight. I shook my head, trying to dismiss the thought. It was probably just the isolation getting to me. I wasn't used to being this far away from everything, and I didn't like how it made me feel. But I followed Evan inside anyway. The door creaked as I pushed it open. It was colder inside than I had expected. The wooden floors were covered in dust, and the smell of mildew hit me as soon as I stepped in. It was the kind of smell that made you want to leave, but at the same time, it was the kind of smell that made you feel like you were stepping into a time capsule, a place frozen in the past. The cabin had a small living area with a few mismatched chairs and a faded rug on the floor. The fireplace was a stone structure, dark and unused. There was a kitchen off to the side, its counters cluttered with old cooking supplies, and a small staircase that led up to the second floor. Evan threw his bag on the couch and made a beeline for the fireplace. "I'll get the fire started," he said, already rummaging through the pile of wood by the wall. "You unpack." I nodded, though I wasn't sure what I'd unpack. I had only brought the basics, clothes, a few books, and a flashlight. I didn't plan on doing much. Just being here, away from everything, was enough. As I unpacked, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off about the cabin. It wasn't just the smell or the state of disrepair. It was the way the place felt, the way it seemed to watch you. Every now and then, I would glance up and catch a glimpse of something out of the corner of my eye. A shadow moving in the corner, a quick flicker of motion. But every time I looked, nothing was there. By the time I finished unpacking, Evan had the fire going. The flickering orange light filled the room, casting long shadows on the walls. I could feel the warmth of the flames on my skin, but it didn't seem to chase away the cold that had settled in my bones. "You good?" Evan asked, settling down in a chair near the fire. He tossed me a beer, and I caught it, popping the tab and taking a long sip. It wasn't bad, but it wasn't great either. It tasted like one of those beers you drink just because it's there, not because you're thirsty for it. "Yeah," I said, though I wasn't sure I was. "It's just different, you know?" Evan didn't seem to care. He was already lost in his own thoughts, staring into the fire. The room felt unnaturally quiet, the kind of quiet that presses on your eardrums until every little sound becomes amplified. The crackle of the fire, the occasional creak of the old wood settling. It was almost too much to bear. Later that night, after the fire had died down, we went to bed. The room I was staying in was upstairs, at the end of a narrow hallway. The door creaked as I opened it, and I stood there for a moment, staring at the bed. It was an old four-poster with fraying sheets and a sagging mattress. The room was sparse. Just the bed, a nightstand, and a small window that looked out into the woods. The moonlight filtered through the trees, casting long shadows across the floor. I wasn't sure if I was tired or just unsettled, but I climbed into bed anyway. The blanket smelled musty, but it was warm, and I was grateful for that. I pulled it up over my shoulders and closed my eyes, trying to block out the unease that had settled in my chest. I needed sleep. Tomorrow would be better, but sleep didn't come easily. Every time I drifted off, I was jolted awake by the sound of something. A thud, like footsteps. A creak, like someone walking on the floorboards. My eyes would snap open, my heart pounding in my chest. But when I looked around, I saw nothing. It happened again and again. Thud, creak, thud. I got up once to check the cabin, but everything was locked up tight, and no one was there. It didn't make sense. There was no reason for it, no explanation I could come up with. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and I fell into a restless sleep. But even then, I could feel the weight of the cabin pressing down on me, like it was trying to swallow me whole. The sun had just dipped below the treeline when I arrived at the cabin. It was an old, wooden structure tucked away deep in the forest, miles from the nearest town. A place I had rented for the weekend to get away from the city, clear my head, and unwind. At least, that's what I told myself as I turned off the engine of my truck and stared out at the woods that surrounded me. The trees stood like silent sentinels, their tall trunks stretching into the sky, their branches thick with dark green needles that seemed to absorb the fading light. It was peaceful, almost too peaceful. I had been looking for some solitude, but I hadn't expected the isolation to feel quite so heavy. The cabin was exactly as described in the listing: rustic, old, and a bit run down, but charming in its own way. A stone fireplace stood at the center of the living room. The smell of old wood and earth permeated the air, and the floorboards creaked underfoot as I unpacked my things. I had no cell service here, no distractions, just me and the quiet. There was a small kitchen tucked into the back corner of the cabin, its shelves lined with mismatched mugs and plates. A single bedroom upstairs, the stairs narrow and steep, leading to a bed that looked like it hadn't been used in years. The windows were framed by heavy curtains, which I drew back to let in the last light of the evening. The view outside was nothing but dense forest and a winding dirt path that disappeared into the trees. As the night deepened, I started a fire in the fireplace and sat in the leather chair by the window, watching the shadows dance across the walls. The warmth from the flames was comforting, but something about the cabin felt off. It wasn't the kind of place where you'd expect anything to go wrong, but there was an unease in the air, a tension I couldn't place. I tried to shrug it off. It was just my mind playing tricks, I thought. I had been so wrapped up in work and life lately that maybe I was just a little jumpy. The night was still, and the silence was absolute, save for the crackling of the fire and the occasional rustle of wind outside. I ate dinner, simple stuff: canned soup, bread, and some fruit. It wasn't much, but it was enough. Afterward, I made a cup of tea and sat by the fire, trying to relax. The warmth from the hearth was the only thing that kept the chill from creeping into my bones. The hours slipped by slowly. The clock on the wall ticked, marking the passage of time in the otherwise quiet house. I started to feel drowsy, but something kept me from falling asleep. Maybe it was the feeling that the night was pressing in a little too close, the darkness outside creeping up to the windows, staring in like it was waiting for something. Around midnight, I decided to turn in. The upstairs bedroom was small, with a single bed and a window that overlooked the woods. The bed felt cold, despite the thick blankets. I pulled the covers up tight around me and tried to ignore the way the floorboards groaned under the weight of unseen footsteps. As I lay there, eyes wide open, I began to hear something. It was faint at first, just a whisper of sound, like something brushing against the cabin's walls. My breath caught in my throat. I sat up in bed, straining to listen. There it was again, a soft tapping like nails or small stones hitting the wood. I froze. It wasn't the wind. The trees outside weren't moving, and the air was still. I told myself it was just an animal, maybe a raccoon or a squirrel scurrying along the cabin's exterior. But it didn't feel like that. There was a rhythm to the sound, as if something was deliberately tapping against the wall. I grabbed my flashlight from the nightstand and crept toward the door. I stepped into the hallway, my footsteps barely making a sound on the old wooden floor. The noise continued, closer now, as if it was coming from somewhere inside the house. I swung the flashlight's beam around the room, heart pounding. Nothing. The light flickered for a second, and in that moment, the tapping stopped. I was left in complete silence. I stood there, frozen, my pulse racing in my ears. Part of me wanted to run, to grab my things and leave the cabin, but I didn't. I couldn't explain why. Something was keeping me there, as though the house itself was holding me in place. I decided to check the lower floor, just to make sure everything was okay. The living room was empty. The front door was locked. Nothing seemed out of place. But that's when I noticed it. The window. The curtains were drawn, but I could see the reflection of the trees in the glass. And in the reflection, just behind the tree line, there was a shape, figure. It was tall, its outline jagged against the backdrop of the trees. For a moment, I thought it was a trick of the light, a shadow cast by the branches. But then it moved, slowly, deliberately. Person? No, not a person. I blinked, and when I looked back, it was gone. My heart thudded in my chest. I didn't know what I had seen, but I knew I wasn't imagining it. The figure was real. I quickly shut the curtains, my hands trembling. I didn't know if I should call someone, if anyone would even hear me. There was no one around for miles. I spent the rest of the night sitting by the window watching the dark. Nothing happened. No more tapping. No more figures in the trees. The fire eventually died down, leaving the room cold and dark. But I didn't sleep. The next morning, the sun was bright and the air fresh. I told myself it was all just nerves. I was tired. Maybe I had imagined the figure, the tapping, the odd feeling. But then I went outside. The yard around the cabin was empty, but the dirt path that led into the woods was worn, as though someone had walked there recently. The ground was soft, still damp from the previous night's chill, and there were fresh footprints leading into the forest. I stood there for a long time, staring at them. They were too large to be mine, too fresh to be from anyone else who had been here before me. The forest was silent again, but this time, the silence felt like a warning. I didn't stay much longer. I packed up my things, left the cabin, and drove away without looking back. As I made my way down the road, I glanced in the rearview mirror. The cabin was still there, standing in the woods, waiting. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been waiting for me, too. Something that had wanted me to stay. I was 34 the year I left the city. I'd worked 10 years as a paramedic in Denver, 10 long, loud, exhausting years. My hands had stopped shaking after the first couple, but the noise never faded. The sirens, the voices, the street radios always chattering in my ear. It all just layered into my head like bricks stacked in wet cement. My body was tired, sure, but my mind felt like a scratched-up record, always skipping back to the worst parts. Burned kids, overdosed teenagers, old men slumped on their porches. I saw them all, every time I closed my eyes. So I quit. I sold my half of the duplex, left the rest of my stuff in storage in a friend's garage, and bought an old hunting cabin in northern Idaho, a few miles from the Canadian border. It had no cell service, no power grid hookup, and a well that needed pumping by hand. I told myself it would be a break, just a long, quiet break, maybe a year or two, long enough to figure out how to feel normal again. The cabin sat on a 10-acre piece of land that had probably looked exactly the same for 100 years. Tall pine trees pressing in tight on all sides, a crooked creek running just behind the property, and a narrow dirt road that split off from the highway and twisted through the woods like a drunk man trying to walk straight. The man who sold it to me, a gruff guy named Weller with a stitched-up lip and skin like leather, said he'd used it every fall for elk season but hadn't come up in years. Said the place needed work, but the bones were good. I bought it after one visit. It was September when I moved in, and the weather was already changing. Up there, fall hits fast and hard. One week you're sweating in a long-sleeved shirt. The next you're breaking ice out of the water bucket in the morning. I spent my first few weeks chopping wood, sealing up the windows, and stocking food I'd hauled up from the Safeway 45 minutes south. I had a propane stove, a cast iron skillet, and a kerosene lantern I bought at a secondhand store. Felt like playing house at first. Simple, quiet, stripped down. The first few nights were the hardest. No noise except the wind, the trees creaking, and the occasional sound of something big moving through the underbrush. It wasn't like the city. There was no white noise to drown things out. Up there, every sound had weight. Every twig snap made my chest tighten. I didn't sleep well for the first week. Kept a loaded .45 on the nightstand even though I hadn't shot it in years. But slowly I adjusted. I read a lot, journaled, took long walks through the woods. Sometimes I wouldn't see another human being for days, and that suited me just fine. But things started to change in late October. I remember the exact day because I'd just come back from my monthly grocery run. I'd driven the hour to the town of Bonners Ferry, filled the back of my truck with canned goods, flour, sugar, oats, jerky, stuff that wouldn't spoil too fast, and started back toward the cabin just as the sun was dipping behind the mountains. I turned off the highway onto the dirt road, headlights cutting through the dark, my tires bumping hard over rocks and potholes like always. I wasn't more than a mile from the cabin when I saw something in the road. It looked like a backpack, just sitting there in the middle of the trail, one of the shoulder straps torn, the fabric stained with what looked like dirt and old watermarks. I slowed the truck and got out, shining my flashlight on it. It was a hiking pack, the kind you see on people doing the Pacific Crest Trail, worn, dusty, and way too big to have just blown off someone's shoulder. Inside, there were some clothes, a cracked Nalgene bottle, and a small notebook. No ID, no phone. Nothing that gave me a name or even a hint of where it had come from. The notebook had only a few pages used, mostly scrawled notes about hiking distances and meals eaten. The last entry said, "Camped near stream. Coyotes close. Saw smoke this morning." That was it. I figured someone had just gotten lost or turned around and dropped the thing. It happens. People think they can handle backcountry hiking and don't plan for the cold or the terrain. I moved the pack off the road and kept driving. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. It had been there too cleanly, dead center in the trail, like someone had placed it. A few days later, I was out back splitting wood when I noticed fresh boot prints behind the cabin. I hadn't walked that way. The prints were narrow, light, probably a man but smaller than me. I followed them down toward the creek, past the rusted-out fence line that marked the back edge of the property. The prints crossed over a mossy patch of ground, stopped near a cluster of trees, and vanished. No return prints, just a one-way path in. I spent hours scouring the woods for signs of someone. Yelled out, waited, nothing. Just silence and trees and the steady sound of the water trickling by. Eventually, I gave up and went back inside, but I didn't sleep that night. My stomach was a knot of tension. I kept thinking about the pack, about the notebook, the coyotes, the smoke. By the time November rolled around, it had snowed twice. Just light dustings, but enough to make tracking easier. I started doing long patrols around the property every morning. It gave me peace of mind, mostly, and I told myself it was just a good habit. But I think, deep down, I was looking for something. Proof that I wasn't imagining things. Some days I found tracks, boot prints, sometimes animal, but they never lasted more than a few yards. Like whoever made them had been careful. Like they knew how to hide. Then came the night I heard the whistle. It was around 2 in the morning. I'd been tossing and turning, sweating under thick blankets even though it was freezing outside. I got up to relieve myself and stepped out onto the porch. The air was so cold it burned my lungs. Everything was dead quiet. And then I heard it. A whistle. High-pitched, short, like someone trying to get a dog's attention. Came from the woods behind the cabin. Not close, but not far either. I froze, waited, heard it again. Same tone, same length, like a signal. I didn't go back to bed. I sat by the front window with the gun on my lap until the sun came up. After that, I started locking the cabin from the inside with a steel bar I rigged across the door. I boarded up the back window, nailed shut the cellar door. Something in my brain had shifted. It wasn't fear exactly, it was focus. A kind of cold, sharp awareness. I had the feeling that someone was watching me. Not constantly, not even often, just sometimes. When the wind died, when the woods held still, I could feel it. 3 days before Thanksgiving, I found something hanging from a tree. It was a rabbit, gutted, skinned, and strung up with blue nylon rope like a trophy. The kind of thing a predator doesn't do. No animal in the woods ties knots. The cuts were clean, almost surgical, and the body had been hung just high enough that I couldn't reach it without a stick. There were no boot prints around, just faint impressions in the frozen leaves. Whoever had done it had worn gloves, maybe wrapped their boots in something to muffle the tracks. I took it down and buried it behind the cabin, not because I cared about the rabbit, but because I didn't want to see it. Didn't want to think about who had hung it or why. The next few days, I barely slept. I started carrying the gun with me even inside the cabin. Every creak, every wind gust against the siding made my muscles tighten. I stopped walking out to the creek, stopped going beyond the tree line. It felt like I was in a shrinking box, and every day the walls came in a little tighter. Thanksgiving morning, I found the cellar door pried open. The nails had been pulled cleanly. No mess, no splinters, like someone had taken their time. I had locked it from the inside, wedged a heavy trunk against it, but it was open. Not wide, just enough for me to notice. I stood there for a long time with the gun in my hand, staring down into the blackness. Nothing moved. Nothing made a sound. Closed it. This time I nailed it shut with 12-inch steel spikes and dragged the wood stove in front of it. That night, I didn't sleep at all. I made my decision the next morning. I was going to leave, just pack up and drive back to town. I didn't care if I had to sleep in my truck in the Safeway parking lot for a week. I needed out. My nerves were frayed raw, but the truck wouldn't start. Battery was fine. Fuel was good. It just wouldn't turn over. I tried for an hour, hands shaking so hard I could barely grip the key. I opened the hood, checked the plugs, the wires. Everything looked normal. I was halfway to walking out on foot when I saw it. The fuel line had been cut. A clean slice like from a razor or a scalpel. Whoever was out there, they wanted me stuck. I went back inside and locked every entrance. I nailed boards over the windows and covered them with blankets. I sat in the dark with a lantern and the gun, and I waited. For 2 days, nothing happened. I rationed food, didn't light a fire, slept in shifts. I thought maybe, just maybe, it was over. Maybe whoever it was had gotten bored or gone. But on the third night, I heard something outside. Footsteps, slow, heavy, crunching in the snow, moving in a circle around the cabin. Once, then again, just round and round like I was 39 when I decided to disappear for a while. Not in the dramatic, leaving it all behind kind of way, just the regular kind. The slow, quiet burnout that creeps in after years of sitting in a cubicle under fluorescent lights while your spine coils tighter by the month. I'd worked as a claims adjuster at a small insurance firm in Dayton for close to 15 years, and the last 6 months had felt like trying to shovel snow during a blizzard. So, when my cousin emailed me in late September saying his buddy had a cabin in southern Illinois he wasn't using for the winter, something in me snapped into motion. I had vacation days piled up, no one to explain myself to, no kids, no girlfriend, not even a dog. I just said yes. The cabin sat about 10 miles west of a little town called Herrin, Illinois. Nothing but cornfields, patches of woods, and rusted barns leaning with age. The guy who owned the place, Ryan, was a hunting guide who spent most of the year up in Montana. He'd left me a key taped under the propane tank and a list of things I might need to know. How to run the generator, what trails to avoid after rain, and which part of the woods the coyotes like to hang around at night. I got there the second week of October. Leaves had just started turning. A thick rust-colored carpet covered the ground around the cabin, and I could smell wood smoke from somewhere far off. The drive-in had been rough. 5 miles of washboard gravel that had my old Ford rattling like a drawer full of cutlery. But I remember feeling a strange calm settle over me once I stepped out. The cabin itself was nothing fancy. Single story, dark green siding, shingled roof with some moss creeping along the edges, a porch with a warped railing. Inside, there was one main room with a cot on one side, a wood stove in the middle, and a kitchenette on the far end. There was a bathroom with an ancient-looking toilet and a cracked mirror above the sink. That was it. The first few days passed the way I'd hoped they would. I read, made soup on the stove, walked in the woods, took long naps. I kept my phone off most of the time and left my laptop packed away. I barely checked the time, except when I noticed the sun dropping behind the trees in the early evening. There was no TV, no internet, no distractions. Felt good. Simple. But by the 5th day, something small started nagging at me. Nothing dramatic, just little things. I noticed that one of the trail markers, a white rag tied to a branch, was gone. I'd walked that loop 3 times since I got there, and I remembered it clearly. Then I found a boot print near the creek that didn't match mine. I wear size 11s, this was bigger. At first, I told myself it was Ryan's from before he left, or maybe a hunter passing through. But it looked fresh. The edges were sharp, and the ground had been damp just 2 nights before. Still, I didn't want to overthink it. I wasn't out there to become paranoid, so I ignored it. I cooked dinner, read some more, and went to bed early. It was around 2 a.m. when I woke up that night to a sound I couldn't place. Not loud, just strange, like something lightly brushing the side of the cabin. I sat up in the cot and held my breath. The sound came again, faint, slow scraping along the exterior wall. I didn't have a gun. Ryan had said there was a .22 in the cabinet, but I hadn't touched it. I wasn't comfortable with guns. Instead, I grabbed my flashlight, walked to the front door, and stood there listening. The sound had stopped. I cracked the door open just enough to shine the beam outside. Nothing. The leaves barely moved. The air was still. I stepped out, heart thudding, and walked the perimeter of the cabin. On the far side, beneath the one window in the bathroom, I found 4 straight scratch marks in the siding, about 2 feet long. Not deep, but too clean to be natural. I squatted down and ran my fingers along them. They looked fresh. I didn't sleep much the rest of the night. The next morning, I made coffee, sat on the porch, and tried to convince myself it was some animal. A raccoon. A bear maybe, though Ryan said they were rare that far south. But in the daylight, things felt less urgent. I let it go. That day, I hiked a longer loop through the woods, trying to shake the nerves. About 4 miles in, I noticed a tree that had been recently chopped into with an axe. 3 diagonal marks, just like the scratch pattern on the siding. Except this time it was deep. Fresh wood showed through the bark, pale and raw. I bent closer. Around the base of the tree, the ground had been disturbed. Leaves kicked away in a wide arc, like someone had been standing there for a while. I didn't see another sign of human presence the whole hike. No wrappers, no cigarette butts, no boot prints. But I couldn't shake the feeling I was being watched. That night, I kept the wood stove going and tried to stay awake. I read for hours, but my eyes kept darting to the window. Around midnight, I killed the lights, cracked the window just slightly, and sat in the dark listening. At 1:17 a.m., I heard the same brushing sound again. This time it was lower, slower, like someone dragging their hand along the wooden boards just beneath the window. I froze, didn't move. I didn't turn the flashlight on. I just sat there, heart hammering, ears straining. The sound stopped. Then a new one began. Light footsteps, crunching leaves near the front porch. I moved quietly to the door and pressed my ear against it. A full minute passed. Then I heard 3 slow knocks. Not loud, not urgent, just patient. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. I stayed frozen until the knocks stopped. Then silence again. I didn't sleep, just waited for the sky to turn blue through the window. The next morning, I found fresh footprints in the dirt about 6 feet from the porch. Same size as before, bigger than mine. I followed them for a bit, but they disappeared about 20 yards into the woods, where the leaves were thicker. Whoever it was knew where to step. I packed my stuff. I was done. But as I loaded the cooler into the truck bed, I saw something that stopped me cold. A small bundle, tied with twine, sitting on the driver's seat. I didn't put it there. I hadn't even unlocked the truck yet. It was a cloth pouch, maybe from a flannel shirt sleeve, crudely tied. I opened it and found inside a dead bird, its neck twisted, its wings folded backward. There was also a tooth, maybe human, maybe not, and a single spent bullet casing. I didn't touch anything else. Just dropped the pouch, locked the truck, and went back into the cabin. I was angry now. Scared, yes, but also furious. Someone was messing with me, and they were good at it. Careful, quiet. I grabbed the rifle from the cabinet, checked it was loaded, and sat by the window until nightfall. Around 11:30 p.m., the noises started again. This time it wasn't brushing. It was footsteps, deliberate, circling the cabin. I didn't move, I kept the gun on my lap, finger near the trigger. Then I heard it, the sound of someone trying the back door. Not forcing it, just testing, gently rattling the handle. I moved quietly through the cabin and positioned myself near the rear wall. My pulse pounded so hard it hurt. I waited, listened, then the knocking again. 3 slow taps. I didn't open the door. I didn't say anything. Eventually, the sounds stopped. At dawn, I walked the perimeter again. No new marks, no tracks I could find. The pouch was gone from where I dropped it. I left 2 hours later. I never saw a face, never got a license plate, never found out who it was. But I know someone was there, and they knew how to stay hidden. I didn't report it. I couldn't explain it. There was no crime to prove, no damage done technically, just a slow erosion of comfort, of trust. The next month, Ryan emailed asking how the cabin had been. I told him I left early, said it was too quiet for me. He said that made sense. Then he mentioned something that stuck with me. The last guy who stayed there, his cousin from Missouri, had also left early. Didn't say why, just said he felt watched the whole time. I don't go into the woods alone anymore. Not because I believe in ghosts or demons. I don't. I believe in people. And I know now that some people have the time, the patience, and the darkness inside them to make you question your reality. I've thought about that cabin every day since I left. I still don't know what the end game was, what would have happened if I'd stayed another night. Maybe nothing, maybe everything. But I know this. When you feel watched, when your instincts twist your gut into knots, listen. Don't explain it away. Don't wait for proof. Get out. It was early October 2011 when I decided to take a week off from work and spend some time alone in a cabin my uncle once owned deep in northern Minnesota. I was 34 back then, working a boring office job in Des Moines. My uncle had passed away the year before, and the cabin, half rotted and mostly forgotten, was left to me. I hadn't even seen it in over a decade, but I remembered it vaguely from a hunting trip when I was a teenager. Just a dark, leaning structure in the middle of nowhere, beside a lake so still it didn't even ripple when you skipped stones across it. I didn't have many close friends, no kids, no girlfriend at the time. My mom thought the idea of going alone to a remote cabin was stupid, but she thought everything was stupid, so I didn't listen. I wanted peace. I wanted silence. I was tired of the gray walls at the office and the fake small talk and the beeping microwave in the break room. I wanted to sit with my thoughts and breathe cold, dry air, and maybe fish a little. That was it. I packed light. A cooler full of food, mostly canned stuff and sandwich fixings, a couple gallons of water, my old .30-30 rifle, and a backpack with clothes and a flashlight. I stopped by a bait shop on the way and picked up a few odds and ends, line, hooks, propane canisters. The owner gave me a look when I told him which road I was headed down. "That place still standing?" he said. I told him I'd find out. I reached the cabin late in the afternoon. It was about 4 miles off the main road, a winding dirt path that looked like it hadn't been used in years. Branches scraped against the sides of my truck the whole way in. When I got there, I had to get out and clear a fallen log just to make the last 100 yards. The place was still standing, though barely. A single-story wooden structure, dark from weather and time. The roof sagged on one side, and the front porch steps were missing a few planks. The windows were boarded from the inside, just like my uncle had kept them. It didn't smell like mold or anything terrible, just dry wood, leaves, and old dust. The lake was maybe 50 yards out back, still and glassy, surrounded by thick woods on all sides. There was no electricity, no running water. Just a wood stove in the corner, a rusty metal sink, and a single bed against the back wall with a rolled-up mattress on top. I unloaded my things and opened the windows to air it out. Then I sat on the porch with a warm beer from the cooler and watched the light die behind the trees. For the first time in months, maybe years, I felt calm. The first night was quiet, cold, but quiet. I slept in my sleeping bag on top of the mattress, listening to the creak of the walls and the occasional rustle outside. It wasn't eerie, just old. The kind of silence you only get far from cities and people. I woke up once to pee and stared out into the blackness beyond the porch, hearing something crunch in the leaves off to the right, but it was probably a raccoon or a deer. I went back to bed. The next morning, I made a weak cup of coffee on my propane burner and wandered down to the lake with my rod and tackle box. The air was still and smelled like pine and mud. I cast a few lines and caught nothing, but I didn't care. It was peaceful. The trees across the lake were gold and orange, their reflections almost too perfect to look real. Around noon, I went for a walk through the woods. I didn't go far, just a slow half-mile loop behind the cabin and back. I found the remains of an old tree stand, long collapsed, and a narrow game trail that looked freshly used. Maybe deer, maybe something else. I considered hunting but didn't feel like it yet. Back at the cabin, I made lunch and spent the rest of the day reading a book I'd brought, some old crime novel I found in a box in my closet. That night, though, I started to feel uneasy. Not scared, just off. The air felt heavier somehow, like the woods were pressing in tighter. I built a small fire in the pit outside and sat with it for a while, but I kept looking over my shoulder like someone might be walking up behind me. There was no one, of course. Still, when I finally went inside, I locked the door and propped a chair under the handle. It was stupid, I told myself that, but I did it anyway. I slept lighter that night. I kept waking up to small noises, the wind through the boards, a soft thump on the roof. Around 3 a.m., I heard something louder, a dull scraping sound against the side of the cabin. I sat up and listened. Nothing followed it. Maybe a branch, maybe a raccoon. I held my breath for a long time, then eventually laid back down. The next day, I found scratches on the siding. Not deep, just surface level, like something had dragged a stick or maybe claws along it. I stared at them for a while, trying to make sense of the pattern. It wasn't consistent. Some were vertical, some curved. I brushed it off, told myself it didn't matter. I walked deeper into the woods that afternoon. No path this time, just heading out behind the cabin with my compass and a small pack. I told myself I'd loop around and be back before sunset. I went maybe 2 miles in. The trees were dense and the ground uneven, but I moved slowly, watching my footing. About an hour in, I came across something strange. A metal cage, half buried in leaves. Not big, maybe 4 feet long, 2 feet high. Like a trap, but old and rusted through in places. One end had a bent latch, and there was dried fur stuck to the inside. It looked like it hadn't been touched in years. I took a few photos with my phone, though I had no signal. Something about it made me uncomfortable. Why was it so far from anything? Who had put it there? I made my way back, slower than I planned, and didn't get to the cabin until after dark. I didn't eat. I just locked the door and sat by the window listening. There were more sounds that night. Branches snapping, a strange, wet shuffling sound at one point. I couldn't explain it. I stayed up until sunrise, watching shadows stretch and shrink across the cabin walls. On the 4th day, I decided to leave. Something felt wrong. I didn't have proof, nothing tangible, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Not ghosts, not anything supernatural. I just felt watched. I started packing around noon, loading the cooler and gear into my truck. I kept my rifle nearby. Then I noticed something. My tire, front driver's side, was slashed. Not flat from a rock or normal wear. Slashed, clean and deep, like someone took a blade to it. I checked the others. One more was cut, back passenger side. I stood there, heart pounding in my throat, scanning the trees. Nothing moved, but I knew it wasn't an accident. Someone had done this. I was trapped, at least until I could change the tires or patch them. I only had one spare. I grabbed the rifle and sat on the porch for a long time, watching the woods. I didn't move, barely even breathed. Around sunset, I saw movement, maybe 100 yards into the trees. Just a flicker. I raised the rifle, but whatever it was ducked out of sight. Could have been an animal. Could have been a person. I didn't sleep that night. I sat with my back to the wall, rifle across my lap. At some point in the early morning, I heard footsteps outside, slow, deliberate. They circled the cabin once, then stopped at the door. I didn't breathe. The handle rattled. Softly, just once. Then silence. After 5 minutes, I crept to the window. Nothing. I waited until daylight, then went outside. Whoever it was had left something. Hanging from the doorknob was a piece of rope, frayed, old, tied in a noose. Not a big one, just enough to make a point. I stood there staring at it for a long time before I took it down. That morning, I managed to patch one tire using a kit I had in the truck. I drove out slow, careful not to hit any sharp rocks. The road was worse than before, and I kept looking in the rearview mirror like I expected someone to be there, following. No one was. I got to a gas station about 20 miles out and called the sheriff. Told him someone had been messing around the cabin, cutting tires, leaving threatening stuff. He wrote it down, said they'd send someone out. I knew they wouldn't. I never went back. A year later, I sold the land. Some guy from Wisconsin bought it for cheap. He didn't ask questions. I didn't offer any. Now, more than 10 years later, I still think about it. I've read stories about squatters, hermits, survivalists who live out in the woods and don't want company. Maybe it was something like that. Maybe I wandered too far, found something I shouldn't have, and someone decided to scare me off. Whatever it was, it worked. And the worst part? That cage I found. When I went back through my phone a few weeks after I got home, the photos were gone. Not corrupted, not blurry, just gone. Every other picture on the phone was fine. Just those. I still have the rope, though. I keep it in a box in the attic, wrapped in plastic. Every few years, I take it out and look at it, just to remind myself how real it all was. No ghosts, no demons, just people. And people are the scariest thing out there. It was September of 2017 when I decided to finally take a break. I just turned 34, had been working non-stop for the past 8 years running my own carpentry business, and I was burned out. Not in the theatrical way people say when they want sympathy. I was actually burned out. Couldn't sleep, couldn't focus. I started forgetting names and misplacing tools. I even forgot to pick up my dog from the groomer once, which I never would have done back when my head was on straight. So when my cousin Todd offered me the use of his cabin out in Montana, I said yes. No hesitation. He had a small, beat-up place about 20 miles outside of Kalispell. I'd been there once before, back when we were kids, and I remembered it being basic but peaceful. No cell signal, no Wi-Fi, just pine trees, a creek behind the property, and a lot of quiet. That's what I wanted. Quiet. I left Indianapolis on a Monday morning and drove the whole way. Took me about 24 hours with a stop at a motel in South Dakota. I brought only the basics. Clothes, a cooler full of food, some bottled water, my toolbox, and a few old books. No laptop, no TV, no distractions. I wanted to reset. The last stretch of the drive took me through a long gravel road that wound through the hills. No houses, no gas stations, just trees. The air smelled like pine and cold dirt. When I finally pulled up to the cabin, it looked exactly how I remembered it. Small, gray, with a sagging porch and a tin roof that looked like it had survived a few storms too many. I parked the truck, grabbed my bag, and walked inside. The place was musty, but clean enough. There was a single room with a bed on one side, a small kitchen against the wall, a rust-stained bathroom in the back, and a fireplace with an old armchair and a stack of firewood next to it. I lit a few candles, unpacked, and sat on the porch until it got dark. Then I went inside, cracked open a book, and read until I fell asleep. The first night was uneventful. I slept through the whole thing, which hadn't happened in months. I woke up to the sound of birds and the wind in the trees. I made coffee on the old propane stove and sat on the porch watching the sun come up. Felt like exactly what I needed. For the next 2 days, I settled into a routine. I'd wake up early, take a walk through the woods behind the cabin, maybe fish a little in the creek if I felt like it, then spend the afternoon reading or sketching furniture designs in my notebook. I didn't see a single person. It was perfect. But then on the 4th morning, I noticed something weird. I was walking a trail about half a mile from the cabin, just off the main path that loops around the property, when I saw a pile of stones arranged in a perfect circle. At first I figured it was just some old fire pit, but it was too neat. The stones were all about the same size and stacked 3 layers high, forming a low wall about a foot tall. In the center was a small pile of ashes. No wood, no burned trash. Just fine gray ash. Felt out of place. Too deliberate. I stared at it for a while and then moved on. Figured maybe Todd had made it at some point. Or someone camping out here years ago. That night, something woke me up around 3 a.m. It wasn't a noise, not at first. Just a feeling, like someone was watching me. I laid there for a second, listening. The woods were quiet. No wind, no animals, dead silent. Then I heard it, a slow, steady crunching sound, like footsteps on dried leaves. I sat up in bed, heart pounding. The window next to the bed faced the woods, but it was pitch black outside. No moon, no light. Couldn't see a thing. The sound stopped. I waited, barely breathing. Then it started again. Closer this time. Crunch, crunch, pause. I got up, grabbed the flashlight from the nightstand, and quietly stepped to the window. I turned the light on and aimed it outside. Nothing, just trees. I stood there for a long time, flashlight shaking in my hand. After a while, I convinced myself it was a deer or something. I crawled back into bed and didn't sleep the rest of the night. The next morning, I found footprints. They were just outside the cabin, in the soft dirt near the porch steps. Big prints. Boots, by the look of them. They went around the side of the cabin and disappeared into the woods. I stood there staring at them for a long time. My stomach was tight. The nearest neighbor was 5 miles away, and Todd said nobody came up here except him. I hadn't seen a single car since I arrived. The idea of someone walking around the cabin in the middle of the night made me feel sick. I checked the locks on the doors and windows. All good. I thought about leaving, but told myself it was probably just a hunter who wandered too close. Still, I didn't take any chances. That night, I locked every door and window, shoved a chair under the doorknob, and kept a hammer next to the bed. Around 2:30 a.m., the sound came back. Crunch, crunch, pause. I didn't move, just laid there, staring at the ceiling. My breathing was shallow. Then I heard it, 3 slow steps on the porch. The boards creaked under the weight. The sound was heavy, not an animal, person. I held my breath. Whoever it was stopped right outside the door. They stood there for what felt like an hour. No knock, no movement, just standing. Then, as quietly as they came, the footsteps moved off the porch and back into the woods. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. When the sun finally came up, I opened the door and looked around. More footprints, fresh ones, leading to the porch and back into the woods. Same boot tread. I followed them for about 50 yards before they veered off the trail and into the trees. Then they vanished. I packed my bag and loaded the truck. I was ready to leave. I didn't care how peaceful the place was during the day. I wasn't going to stick around and wait to see who was creeping around the woods at night. But the truck wouldn't start. Battery was dead. I checked everything I could, terminals, fuses, fuel. Nothing obvious. It just clicked when I turned the key. I tried jump-starting it with the backup pack Todd left in the glove box. Still nothing. I was stranded. There was no signal on my phone, and I wasn't going to hike 20 miles to town in the middle of bear country. I had food and water for at least a week, so I decided to stay put and wait. Maybe a day or two and someone would come by. That night, I didn't go to bed. I sat in the armchair by the fireplace with the hammer in one hand and the flashlight in the other. I kept the candles out. I wanted it dark. If they came back, I wanted to hear them before they saw me. Around 3 a.m., the footsteps came back. This time, they circled the cabin. Slow, deliberate steps. Around the front, along the side, behind the bathroom, then back to the front. I sat frozen, barely breathing. Then I heard something that made my blood run cold. A soft tap, tap, tap on the bedroom window. 3 taps. Light, almost polite. Then nothing. I didn't move until sunrise. When it got light, I went outside. There were handprints on the window. Smudged, but unmistakable. Big, wide palms. Not wearing gloves. I didn't eat that day. Couldn't. My stomach was in knots. I kept trying the truck, hoping it would magically start. Nothing. I even tried using the axe from the shed to chop down a tree and signal from the clearing, but it was pointless. Nobody was coming. That night was worse. He came back. I never saw him, but I knew he was there. He walked around the cabin all night, slow, steady footsteps. At one point, I heard the doorknob jiggle, then silence, then footsteps again. At sunrise, I opened the door and found a gift. Right on the porch, in the center of the welcome mat, was a dead rabbit. No head, clean cut, like it had been done with a knife. Next to it, a single matchstick. I stared at it for a long time. Then I threw up in the bushes. I went inside, grabbed my bag, and left. I didn't care if it was 20 miles. I was gonna walk until I found a road or a house or someone with a radio. But I didn't make it a mile before I saw the trap. It was on the trail, disguised under a thin layer of leaves and branches. A crude snare made from wire and wood, big enough for a person. If I'd stepped in it, I probably would have shattered my ankle. I turned back. I didn't know what to do. Whoever he was, he knew the woods better than me. He knew where I walked, what time I went to bed. He was watching, always watching. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat in the armchair again, hammer in hand, staring at the door. Around 2 a.m., the footsteps came. Slower this time, like he knew I was awake. Then something new, the sound of something being poured. Then a click. The smell hit me a second later. Gasoline. I jumped up and ran to the door, pulled it open and shined the flashlight into the dark. No one there, but I saw it. A can of gasoline on the ground, spilled all over the porch. A book of matches laying open next to it. He was gonna burn me out. Panicked, grabbed my pack, shoved my boots on, and ran into the woods. I didn't care where I went, I just ran. It belonged to my uncle, Wes. He'd bought it back in the early 80s. A little two-bedroom place out in northern Arkansas near Bell Creek. The kind of isolated, wood-paneled structure you see in old outdoor magazines. Weather-beaten porch, tin roof, a creek 10 feet behind it, and miles of forest in every direction. Wes wasn't the type for small talk or company. He was ex-military, never married, had no kids, just a stubborn man with a long white beard and a bad back who spent his last 20 years mostly alone. He died in the fall of 2017. Left everything to me because, as the lawyer explained, I was the only one who ever bothered to answer his calls. When I got the paperwork in the mail, I barely remembered the last time I saw him. Probably my high school graduation. That was almost 12 years ago. I remember thinking it was a joke. I was 31, living in Dallas, working in IT. No clue what to do with a rundown cabin 5 hours away. I figured I'd check it out, see if it was worth selling, maybe fix a few things. A weekend away, nothing more. The plan was to drive up on a Friday morning, spend the night, and head back Sunday before dark. I packed some canned food, water, sleeping bag, a small toolkit, a camp stove, and my Glock 19. Not because I expected trouble, just habit from growing up in Texas. I texted a friend the location and told him I'd check in every evening. Cell service was spotty that far out, but I figured I could drive 10 minutes back toward the highway if I needed to call. The road to Bell Creek wasn't on any map. The GPS cut out an hour before I got there. After a long, winding stretch of county road, I finally found the narrow dirt path that turned off into the woods. It was marked by a sun-faded metal sign that read Bell Creek, Tract 12, Private Property, in chipped white paint. I drove slow, branches scraped the sides of the car, and potholes made the wheels stutter. But eventually the trees opened up and there it was, the cabin. It looked almost exactly like I remembered, though older. Siding warped from weather, a patch of moss taking over one side of the roof. The steps creaked under my boots. The door stuck a little. I had to lean into it to get it open. The air inside was stale, like wood rot and dust and something faintly metallic. There were old newspapers stacked on a chair by the door, years old. Empty beer cans lined the windowsills. A cast iron stove sat dead in the corner, and the windows had yellowed plastic over them like insulation. My uncle had nailed thick wooden boards across the inside of each one. Not plywood, but proper oak boards drilled in tight from the inside. It struck me as strange, but maybe he was paranoid about break-ins. I spent the rest of Friday cleaning up. There was no electricity, but the plumbing still worked. Barely. The water came out orange at first, then cleared. I opened all the windows, pried a few of the boards loose to let in light, and swept out the dust and dead bugs. I didn't touch the bedroom. The door was shut, and the doorknob was duct taped over like it was broken. I figured I'd sleep in the front room. My sleeping bag went in the corner under a window. I cooked a small dinner on the camp stove, listened to the sound of crickets and the creek outside, then went to bed. I didn't sleep well. The quiet was too loud, if that makes sense. In the city, there's a kind of constant low hum, cars, people, distant sirens. Out there, every twig snap or animal cry cut through the dark like it was right outside. I heard something knock against the far wall around 2 a.m. Just once. Probably a raccoon or branch. Still, I stayed awake a while listening. Saturday morning, I decided to take a look around. The woods were thick but not impassable. I followed the creek upstream a bit. The water was clear, cold. I found an old rusted trap nailed to a tree, the kind used for small game, long forgotten. About half a mile up, I spotted what looked like a collapsed treehouse in a pine tree. Just splinters and beams now. I didn't climb up. When I got back to the cabin, I noticed the side door. An old service entrance off the kitchen was cracked open, just an inch. I was sure I'd latched it before leaving. The lock was a simple bolt. It looked untouched. I walked the perimeter, gun drawn just in case, but saw no signs of forced entry. No boot prints, no broken glass. Still, something was off. Inside, nothing looked disturbed. The bag I left by the door was still zipped. The food was where I left it. I told myself maybe the bolt hadn't fully caught and the wind pushed it open. That afternoon, I finally decided to check the bedroom. I cut the duct tape and turned the knob. It was stiff but turned. The room inside was dark. Shades drawn, boards still nailed up. The smell hit me first. Not decay, but something like sweat and rust. The room was sparse. A bed with no sheets. A desk with papers stacked on it. One chair. In the corner was an old filing cabinet, dented and locked. On the walls were nails, dozens of them, hammered in at shoulder height in irregular patterns. Some had little bits of string hanging from them. I didn't understand it. On the desk was a notebook, leather cover, thick. My uncle's name was inside the front. Most of the pages were filled with tight, slanted handwriting. No dates, just page after page of descriptions about the forest, the cabin, what he called the Watchers. First I thought it was fiction, but the tone was wrong. There was no narrative, no plot, just him recording things he'd seen. _3 figures in the tree line this morning. Same as before. Not moving, just watching. __ woke to tapping on the back wall. Nothing there when I checked. Left boot prints though, bare feet. __ they don't like the light. I think they hate the creek. __ I've been sealing the windows tighter. They press their faces against the glass. _ I read about 30 pages before I stopped. It was rambling, repetitive, paranoid. Maybe he had some kind of late-onset schizophrenia. That would explain the boarded windows and the strange behavior. I didn't want to read more. I spent the rest of the day fixing the back steps. They were rotted through, and I had brought a few boards from Home Depot just in case. Working with my hands helped take my mind off the journal. That night, I made dinner, had a beer, and sat on the porch as the sun went down. The sky turned pink, then dark blue. The air felt too still. No wind, no bugs, no frogs or crickets. Just quiet. Then I saw the deer. It stood at the edge of the trees, maybe 30 feet away. A doe. His body was thin, ribs showing, one ear torn. But it didn't act like a deer. It didn't twitch or sniff the air. It didn't blink. It just stood there, head turned slightly toward me. I watched it for maybe 10 minutes. It didn't move. Then I stood up, and it bolted into the trees without a sound. Back inside, I double-bolted the door, pushed a chair against it, and made sure every window was secure. I loaded the Glock and kept it within arm's reach as I got into my sleeping bag. I turned on my flashlight and set it beside me. I didn't sleep. Around 3 a.m., I heard the back door rattle. Just once. A single jiggle of the handle. Not wind, not an animal. I stayed still, breath held. The sound didn't come again. When the sun rose, I packed my things. I left the notebook on the desk. I didn't want it, didn't want any of it. I took one last look around, shut the door behind me, and locked it. Then I walked to my car, tossed my bag in the passenger seat, and turned the ignition. The engine clicked, then nothing. I tried again. Nothing. The lights worked. Battery wasn't dead. I popped the hood, no obvious damage. No wires chewed. I was no mechanic, but it made no sense. It had started just fine the day before. That's when I saw the footprints. Not shoe prints. Bare feet. Small. Human. They circled the car. Around and around. To the back, the passenger side, the driver's side. Then off into the trees. I backed away, hand on my gun. I scanned the forest. Nothing moved. I thought about hiking to the road, but it was almost 5 miles, and I wasn't sure I could find my way without the car's GPS. Besides, something told me not to leave the car. Not yet. I got in, locked the doors, and waited. I tried the engine again every hour. It finally started at 11:22 a.m. No explanation, just roared to life like nothing had happened. I didn't wait. I drove fast, swerving around potholes, scraping the trees. I didn't look in the rearview mirror. Didn't stop at the gas station off 41. Didn't stop until I hit the state line and saw a cop car parked by the way station. Only then did I pull over just to feel like I was near other people again. I sold the cabin that winter. Some guy in Little Rock bought it without ever visiting. I dropped the keys in a padded envelope and mailed them. Never heard from him again. That was 6 years ago. Since then, I haven't gone back to Arkansas. My name is Mason. I'm 43 now, but what happened to me when I was 27 still hangs around in my mind like a bad smell. It was the summer of 2006, and I'd just come off a rough stretch. My fiancée had left me 6 months earlier, and I'd been bouncing between jobs, nothing sticking. I needed something to clear my head, a reset. My cousin, who lived up near Fort Dodge, Iowa, told me about this old cabin behind an abandoned rock quarry his dad used to take him to as a kid. Said it wasn't on any maps, and no one ever went out there anymore. He drew a rough set of directions on notebook paper, landmarks instead of road names. Turn left at the rusted water tower, go past the barbed wire fence with the no trespassing sign that's mostly fallen down. Stuff like that. Sounded sketchy, but I wasn't worried. I didn't plan on seeing anyone. That was kind of the point. I packed light, some canned food, bottled water, a propane stove, a knife, flashlight, tarp, sleeping bag, and a paperback book I figured I'd finally get around to finishing. I had an old 95 Jeep Cherokee that still ran well enough, and I threw everything in the back and headed out there on a Friday morning. Took longer to find the place than I expected. The directions were vague, and the landmarks had changed. The water tower wasn't rusted anymore. It had been repainted recently, and the no trespassing sign was completely gone. Still, I eventually found the gravel road that wound around the edge of the quarry, and about a mile in, I saw a clearing with the cabin sitting in the middle of it. It looked about as abandoned as you'd expect. Weathered pine planks, a sagging roof, the windows boarded up but not sealed. No driveway or mailbox, just sitting there like it had been dropped into the trees and forgotten. I parked the Jeep under some overgrowth so it wouldn't be visible from the road, just in case anyone happened by. Probably unnecessary, but I liked the idea of being completely alone. I walked up to the cabin, gave the door a push, and it opened with a screech that raised every hair on my neck. It smelled like rot and dust, like it hadn't been opened in years. Inside, there was a single room, a cot, a rusted-out wood stove, a small table with one chair. The floor was covered in leaves and dirt, but it looked solid enough. I swept it out as best I could, set up my sleeping bag on the cot, and lit the small propane lamp I'd brought. It was mid-afternoon by then, the heat hanging thick in the air, and the quiet was complete. That first night was uneventful. I sat on the stoop and ate cold beans straight from the can, listening to the crickets and the occasional rustle in the underbrush. I read a few chapters of the book before the light started to fade, and then I crawled into the sleeping bag and drifted off. It wasn't the most comfortable night of sleep I've ever had, but it wasn't the worst either. The second day, I explored a little. The quarry was about a half-mile walk through dense trees. It was deeper than I expected, with sheer limestone walls and water pooled in the bottom. Looked like it had been dug decades ago and abandoned before they finished. I saw some broken equipment rusting in the distance, a crane half buried in a mound of dirt, metal drums tipped on their sides. No signs of people, no tire tracks or recent trash. That made me feel better. I wanted quiet. I wanted to think. Maybe figure out what the hell I was doing with my life. Back at the cabin, I made a small fire pit out front and used some old wood from behind the building. It was dry and snapped easy. That night, I cooked some ramen over the fire and drank a couple warm beers I'd brought in a cooler. Stars overhead. No phone service. No traffic noise. It was exactly what I'd been looking for. Until the third night. I'd gone to sleep around 10. The air was still and thick, and the woods were loud with bugs. I'd left the door cracked open to let in some air, since the inside got stuffy with no screens on the windows. I was drifting in and out, the fire outside mostly burned down, when I heard something. A footstep. At first I thought it was an animal. A deer maybe, or raccoon. But then I heard it again, slow, deliberate. Human, no doubt. Crunch, crunch. Leaves and twigs under boots. I sat up, heart pounding. It was pitch black in the cabin, and I didn't want to switch on the flashlight and give away my exact location. I listened. The footsteps circled the cabin once, then stopped. I waited. 5 minutes. 10. Nothing. I finally clicked the flashlight on and shined it through the door crack. Nothing but trees. Still, I didn't sleep much that night. Every sound made me sit up. I kept the knife in my hand under the blanket. By morning, I'd convinced myself it was nothing. Maybe some other hiker who'd gotten lost and wandered off when they saw the cabin was occupied. But it didn't sit right. I checked for footprints in the dirt around the cabin but didn't see any, which didn't make sense given how dry the ground was. You should have seen something. A heel mark, anything. But it was like no one had been there. That day, I hiked around the backside of the quarry, deeper into the woods, looking for any sign of campsites or trails. Nothing, just trees and more trees. I didn't even see animal tracks. That started to bug me. You should see deer or coyote or even squirrels. But the woods were strangely empty, too quiet. That night, I locked the door as best I could with an old chain I found behind the stove, wedged a chair under the handle. I didn't leave the door open this time. Around midnight, I was just starting to drift off when I heard it again. Footsteps, same pace, same direction, slow, deliberate. This time they stopped right at the door. I held my breath, didn't move. The footsteps didn't continue. They just stopped. Whoever it was stood there for maybe 2 minutes. Then I heard them walk away into the trees. I got up and opened the door quietly, shined the flashlight in the direction I'd heard the steps go. Nothing, just thick woods and dark shapes. I stayed up until sunrise, listening, watching. Still nothing. The next day, I made up my mind to leave. It wasn't paranoia. I knew someone had been out there, but I had to walk back out to where I left the Jeep, and I didn't want to make that trip in the dark. I packed up everything, left it in the cabin, and did one last sweep of the area just to be sure. That's when I found something I hadn't noticed before. A trail. Faint but definitely there. About 50 yards behind the cabin, just past a patch of overgrown ferns. It looked like someone had walked that way often enough to beat down the grass. It didn't go toward the quarry. It went deeper into the woods, away from everything. I followed it. I shouldn't have, but I did. The trail went on for maybe half a mile, winding through brush and dense trees, until I saw a small structure ahead. Not another cabin, more like a shack, made from plywood, metal sheets, tarps. It looked homemade, maybe even recent. There were empty cans stacked near the door, plastic jugs, some old boots. Someone had definitely been living there. I didn't go inside. I just stood there, staring. That's when I heard the sound. From inside the shack. A dragging sound. Slow, heavy. I didn't wait to find out what it was. I turned and ran back the way I came, didn't stop until I was at the cabin. Grabbed my stuff, barely packed it, just threw everything into my bag. I didn't look back once. I jogged to the Jeep, turned the key, and didn't breathe easy until I was 10 miles down the road. That should have been the end of it, but it wasn't. When I got home 2 days later, there was an envelope in my mailbox. No return address. Inside was a single photograph, me sitting outside the cabin, eating ramen by the fire. It was taken from the trees. From behind me, I moved 3 months later, changed my number, never told anyone about the photograph. I didn't sleep right for a long time after that. Always felt like someone was watching. I still don't know who was out there, what they wanted, or how they found me, but I've never gone camping alone since. I don't usually talk about that weekend in the Upper Peninsula. Even now, years later, I still don't like to think too hard about it. I've told myself every version of the story I can, tried to reshape the memory until it doesn't feel so raw, but it always comes back the same. And not with the horror movie shine people expect when they hear about cabins in the woods, but with something colder, something that stays under your skin. It was September of 2016. I was 33. I'd just taken 2 weeks off work after leaving my job at a construction firm in Lansing. I was tired, mentally and physically, and wanted to be alone. No phones, no noise, just trees and air and quiet. My sister knew a guy who owned a rental cabin about 10 miles outside Lawrence, Michigan. It wasn't on any app or website, just a small, square structure tucked behind a private dirt road, set a few hundred yards from a logging trail. I think it used to be a hunter's retreat. No Wi-Fi, no plumbing either. You had to bring in your own water or boil it from the nearby creek. Just a bed, a stove, and a lock on the door. Sounded perfect. The guy who owned it, Craig, didn't ask for much. Just $200 in cash and a quick phone call to explain how to find the place. Directions included things like, take the left fork after the crooked birch tree, and if you pass the blue mailbox with the shotgun holes, you've gone too far. I took notes and loaded up my 2005 Tacoma with a week's worth of food, a camp stove, sleeping bag, water jugs, a first aid kit, and my old .22 rifle. I didn't plan to use it, I just liked having it nearby. I've always been cautious, sometimes too much, but growing up in northern Michigan teaches you that being too prepared beats the hell out of the alternative. I left on a Thursday morning. The sky was pale and dry, the kind that makes the world look drained of color. I drove 6 hours straight, stopping once for gas and a sub sandwich in Marquette. The paved road eventually narrowed into gravel, and then to something worse than gravel, just ruts and soft dirt between tall trees, the kind of road you pray doesn't wash out in the rain. When I finally saw the old wooden marker Craig had mentioned, a half-buried tire with cabin painted on it in white, I pulled off and followed a barely there track into the forest. The cabin wasn't much. A single-story box with a tin roof and faded green paint. The door sagged slightly on its hinges, and the windows had that cloudy look old glass gets when it's been exposed to too many winters. But it was dry, solid, and surrounded by nothing but trees. No neighbors, no cars, no humming power lines, just quiet. I unpacked and got settled. The inside was cleaner than I expected, basic, but tidy. Someone had swept recently. There was a wood-burning stove in the corner, a small table with one chair, a cabinet with a few cans of beans and instant coffee, and a bed with a foam mattress. Outside, maybe 30 feet away, was a small outhouse and a fire ring made of old stones. I set up my stuff, checked my phone one last time, no bars, and shut it off. I'd never felt better. The first day went exactly how I wanted. I made a small fire outside, ate canned soup straight from the can, and sat watching the trees sway in the wind. It was peaceful, almost too quiet at times, but I told myself that was part of the charm. My sleep that night was deep. No buzzing lights, no cars, no neighbor's dog barking at 3 a.m. Just a blanket of blackness and the sound of wind through pine. The next morning, I woke early, made instant coffee on the little propane stove I brought, and sat on the porch. I packed a couple books, but I didn't feel like reading. I wanted to just sit, I remember thinking how long it had been since I'd felt that. Just stillness. I went for a walk after breakfast, following the old logging trail past the creek. It curved up into a ridge that overlooked a patch of thick woods. I spent an hour there, just taking it in. When I got back, the cabin looked smaller. I don't know why that stuck out to me, but it did. That night, I woke up around 2:30 a.m. I don't know what did it. Maybe a noise or just a weird feeling, but I sat up in bed and listened. No wind, no bugs, nothing. The kind of silence that feels like pressure on your ears. Then I heard it. Not close, but clear. A branch breaking. Not a twig, not something small. A big crack, like something heavy stepped on a dry limb. I froze. My mind ran through options. Deer? Moose? Bear? But the sound didn't come again. I sat there for at least 20 minutes, staring at the door, holding my breath every time I thought I heard something. Eventually, I laid back down, but I didn't sleep much. In the morning, I checked around the cabin. No tracks, no torn trash, nothing disturbed. I convinced myself it was probably just a deer wandering too close. Maybe it stepped on a log. Still, I kept my rifle nearby that day. By the fourth day, I noticed something else, something off. Every morning I'd been there, I'd gone out to collect kindling from a little stretch of forest about 50 yards behind the cabin. It was perfect. Lots of dead limbs, no poison ivy, no thick underbrush. But that day, when I walked out, I saw something strange. Pile of rocks. Not just any pile, a very deliberate stack. 5 flat stones, all roughly the same size, arranged neatly in a low pyramid, right in the middle of the clearing where I'd gathered wood every day. I stopped and just stared at it. I hadn't built it. I hadn't seen it the day before. It wasn't a natural stack either. You could tell someone or something had placed each rock intentionally. I walked around it, crouched down, even touched one. Cold, damp, and solid. I didn't knock it over. I don't know why. Felt wrong. That night, I locked the cabin door. It only had a basic sliding bolt, but it made me feel better. I slept with the rifle by the bed and kept my boots on, just in case. I didn't hear anything that night, but I kept waking up anyway. Every little noise put me on edge. Wind in the trees, creaking wood. It all felt louder. The next morning, I hiked out toward the ridge again. I didn't feel comfortable behind the cabin anymore. Something about the trees back there felt wrong. It's hard to explain. Like the light didn't fall right. The ridge gave me some space, a view of the area. I stood up there for a while, scanning the forest. I didn't see anything, but I kept getting that tight feeling in my chest, like I was being watched. When I got back, I saw something that made my stomach drop. Footprints. 2 sets of them, actually. One leading toward the cabin from the trail behind it, and one leading away back into the woods. They were boot prints about my size, maybe a bit smaller. Fresh, still crisp in the soft dirt. I hadn't walked there that morning. I walked around the cabin, heart pounding. Nothing broken, no windows open. But then I saw the stack of rocks again, this time right beside the fire ring. Same formation. 5 flat stones, perfectly stacked. I grabbed my rifle and sat inside the cabin the rest of the day. I didn't eat. I barely moved. Every few minutes I'd get up and peek through the cloudy window. But there was nothing out there. Just trees and wind. That night I didn't sleep. I sat in the chair, facing the door, watching the shadows stretch and shift across the walls. Around midnight I heard it again. Footsteps. Not far. Just outside. Slow, heavy steps on soft earth. Then silence. Then a creak like wood bending under weight. I held my breath. Something brushed the side of the cabin. A scrape like a hand or a stick dragged across the wall. Then another creak. I raised the rifle, aimed it at the door, heart pounding so hard I thought I'd pass out. But nothing happened. After a long while, the noises stopped. I stayed in that chair until dawn. When light finally broke through the windows, I went outside, rifle in hand. I didn't see anyone, but near the porch steps, there was another pile of rocks. This time, there was something else beside it. A dead rabbit, gutted, laid out on a flat piece of bark. Clean cuts like it had been skinned by hand. That was enough. I packed everything in less than 10 minutes, barely stuffing things into my duffel. I left the rest: food, tools, water. I didn't care. I just needed to leave. I threw my gear in the truck, backed out fast, and tore down the dirt road, scraping branches and bouncing over potholes. I didn't stop until I hit pavement. I drove all the way to Marquette, checked into a motel off the highway, and locked the door behind me. I didn't sleep that night either, just stared at the ceiling, heart still racing, trying to piece it all together. There was no ghost, no monster, just something or someone out in those woods, watching me, waiting, leaving signs. The police didn't do much when I called them the next day. Took a report, said maybe it was a prank, maybe a poacher or a squatter. They didn't send anyone out. I never went back. Never heard from Craig again either. His number stopped working a month later. My sister couldn't reach him. I don't know what happened to the cabin. I don't care. All I know is that I was 32 the year I decided to rent out a small cabin deep in the woods of northern Minnesota. It was late October. The leaves had already turned and fallen, and the air held that sharp bite that always seemed to show up a few weeks before winter. I'd been working long hours at a job I didn't care for in the city, and I felt like I was losing pieces of myself in the traffic, the concrete, the noise. I just wanted quiet. I wanted to be left alone for a while. No emails, no phone calls, just a wood stove, some books, and the sound of wind in the trees. I found the cabin online. It was a small one-bedroom place listed by a retired couple who lived about 20 minutes away in town. The pictures showed a single-story wood structure with a slanted tin roof, a little porch out front, and a trail that disappeared into the forest behind it. The ad said it had solar power, a wood stove, a small gas stove for cooking, and a hand pump for water just outside. No Wi-Fi, no television. Sounded perfect. I packed up my old Subaru with groceries, firewood, some paperbacks, a few changes of clothes, and my sleeping bag. I left Minneapolis early in the morning and got to the cabin just after 3 p.m. It was colder than I expected. The sky was a washed-out gray, and the wind kept brushing fallen leaves against the windows like dry whispers. The cabin looked exactly like the pictures, maybe a little more run down. The front porch creaked when I stepped on it, and the screen door hung just slightly crooked. Inside, it smelled like old pine and dust. There was a small table with 2 chairs, a single armchair by the stove, and a narrow bed with a patchwork quilt. Everything was quiet, almost too quiet. The first night was peaceful. I lit a fire in the stove, made myself some instant noodles, and read until my eyes couldn't stay open. The cold crept in fast after the fire died, and I woke up once or twice shivering before I finally got up and restarted the stove. The second day I spent exploring the trail behind the cabin. It wasn't marked, just a worn footpath that led deeper into the woods. I walked for about an hour before turning back, not wanting to get lost. I didn't see or hear anyone else, just a few birds and the occasional rustle of something moving through the underbrush. Felt like I was the only person for miles. It was that night when I started to feel off. Nothing major at first, just little things. I kept thinking I heard someone outside. Small noises, twigs snapping. Once I thought I saw movement just beyond the tree line when I looked out the front window, but it was probably a deer or something. I kept telling myself it was nothing, but it kept happening. Every night, around the same time, between 10 and 11, I'd hear it. Footsteps. Not animals, not the soft shuffle of wind, but real, measured footsteps, just outside. They'd come up to the porch, pause, and then fade away. I never saw anyone. I never caught anything with the flashlight. Just silence and that growing, gnawing feeling that someone was watching me. I stopped sleeping through the night. I started staying up, keeping the fire going, listening. On the 5th night, I heard the footsteps again, but this time they didn't fade away. They moved around the side of the cabin. I sat frozen in the armchair, holding my breath, straining to hear. There was a creak, like weight on the back porch, and then silence. I jumped up, grabbed the flashlight, and swung open the back door, shining the light into the woods. Nothing. No one. The next morning I found prints. Not animal tracks, boot prints. They circled the cabin and disappeared into the woods. I stood there staring at them for a long time. My first thought was that someone was screwing with me, maybe a hunter or a local teenager. But why? No one knew I was here. I hadn't told anyone besides the rental owners, and they had no reason to lie. I hiked into town that afternoon, found the couple's house. They were nice enough. The husband, Greg, offered me coffee, and his wife, Marianne, asked if I was enjoying my stay. I brought up the footprints, casually, trying not to sound paranoid. Greg frowned and shook his head. He said no one should be out there. He hadn't rented the place to anyone else, and most of the locals didn't come this far into the woods. Marian offered to call the sheriff if I was worried, but I said no. I didn't want to make it a big deal. That night, I didn't sleep at all. I kept the fire going bright and sat with my back to the wall, listening. Around 10:30, I heard them again. Footsteps, this time slower, deliberate. They circled the cabin twice. I kept waiting for the knock, the creak, the door handle to jiggle, but it didn't come. Just that slow pacing, like whoever it was wanted me to know they were there. In the morning, I packed up. I was done. I didn't care that I had 5 more days left. I loaded my things into the car as fast as I could. That's when I noticed something that stopped me cold. The screen on the front window had been cut. Just a small slit, about 6 inches long, clean like it was done with a knife. It hadn't been there before. I was sure of it. I drove straight home. Didn't stop, didn't eat, didn't even look back until I hit the freeway. I didn't tell anyone about it for a while. Not because I was embarrassed, but because I didn't know what to say. Nothing technically happened. I didn't see a face, didn't get attacked. But I know what I heard. I know what I saw. A few weeks later, I got a message from Greg, just a short email. He said a hiker found a campsite not far from the cabin. A crude shelter, empty food cans, some tools and clothing. Looked like someone had been living out there for a while. He said the sheriff thought it might be a drifter, maybe someone who didn't want to be found. They didn't catch anyone, but the campsite was cleared out. I don't know what that person wanted or how long they'd been out there. I think about it sometimes, especially when I'm lying awake in bed, listening to the wind. I still go into the woods, but never alone, and never for more than a day or two. The silence isn't as comforting as it used to be. I guess the scariest part is just knowing that it was real, that someone was out there watching, and I'll never know how close they really got. I was 39 the year I decided to go up north for a while. It was September of 2014, and I'd just gone through a quiet divorce that nobody really knew about outside of a few friends and some coworkers. No drama, just distance. We'd both stopped trying. After she moved out of the house in Wabasha, Minnesota, it felt like I'd been living alone for a lot longer than I actually had. I worked remote, so getting away wasn't hard. I'd grown up in small towns all across the state, and there were places I remembered going with my parents when I was a kid. Cabins, campgrounds, places where the air always felt cleaner and the nights were still. I started looking for something off-grid for a while. Not forever, just for a month, maybe 2. I found a small place listed on an old classified ad site. It wasn't Airbnb or any of those new apps. This was one of those early 2000s message boards for self-sustained travelers or whatever buzzwords they liked. The post was titled Quiet Cabin on Larch Pines Lake, available September-October. There was a photo of a small one-room cabin with a wood stove, a narrow dock, and a red canoe. The guy renting it out, Robert B., just the first initial, had written that it was isolated, best for writers or those needing solitude, and no power, no signal, no internet. Just what I was looking for. I emailed him, wired a deposit through some sketchy money transfer site, and got a reply a few days later with directions and a note that said, Asterisk cabin has basic supplies. Bring headlamp. Bring food. Don't forget water. Asterisk. No address, just directions from a gas station 2 towns over and a photo of a turnoff marker on a tree. A blue bandana nailed to the trunk of a pine. Felt odd, but I liked odd. 2 weeks later, I packed up my truck, drove north for 6 hours, and pulled off the road just like he said. I followed a logging trail for maybe 20 minutes, rough as hell, until the trees opened up to a little clearing with the cabin sitting right on the edge of a narrow lake. It was surrounded by dense pines and brush, almost too dense, like it had been planted to hide the place. The air smelled like cold leaves and wet bark. I stepped out and listened. No sounds, just wind through the trees and the crackle of the truck cooling down. The cabin was smaller than it looked in the picture, maybe 15 feet by 15 feet. One door, two windows, front and back. The wood was gray and peeling. The lock was an old hook latch. Inside, there was a cot, a metal wood stove, a small counter with shelves, and a box of firewood. No bathroom, no running water. Just an outhouse a few yards into the woods, east side of the cabin, painted the same fading brown. I unpacked, set up my bedding, stacked canned food on the shelves, and got the stove going. I didn't even check if I had a signal. I didn't care. For the first few days, it was peaceful. I went on hikes, wrote in a spiral notebook I brought, read some old books I found in a box under the cot. The wind was always blowing, and I got used to the sound of trees creaking and squirrels hopping around on the roof. But around the 5th day, things started to feel off. It started with small stuff. The firewood pile was rearranged one morning. I thought maybe I'd just been careless stacking it. Then I noticed one of the food cans had been moved to the floor. Again, I figured I must have knocked it over and not noticed. But on the 6th night, I woke up around 3 a.m. Not because of a sound, but because of the absence of sound. The wind had stopped. I sat up on the cot, sweating a little despite the cold. There was a small window right above my bed, and moonlight was coming in at just the right angle that I could see the trees swaying lightly in the distance. But near the cabin, still, I sat there, staring, not sure what was bothering me. Then I realized the woods didn't feel empty. You know how it is when you're being watched? That weird pull in your gut? I had that. I got out of bed, threw on my coat, and stepped outside with a flashlight. There were footprints in the mud right outside the window. Not boot prints, bare feet. Human. The mud was cold and wet. The prints were fresh. I turned the beam of the flashlight to the tree lean, but I couldn't see anything. The prints walked right up to the side of the cabin and stopped, like whoever it was had just stood there staring through the window. I went back inside, locked the door, and sat in the chair with my hunting knife in my hand until the sun came up. That morning, I checked all around the clearing. No sign of anyone. I even walked half a mile down the trail, thinking maybe it was some camper or local messing around, but I didn't see any tire tracks or signs of other people. By noon, I convinced myself it had to have been a dream. Maybe I saw animal tracks and imagined the rest. Sleep deprivation can do weird things. I didn't tell anyone. There was no one to tell. That night, I stacked firewood against the door, just in case. The next few days were uneventful. I fished, cooked, stayed busy. I stopped thinking about the footprints. I even convinced myself I'd start a little blog when I got home, write about my off-grid experience, maybe turn it into a book someday. It was peaceful again. I felt better. Then came the 11th day. I woke up late. The cabin was freezing, which meant the fire had gone out sometime during the night. I got up, rubbing my arms, and reached for my boots. They were gone. I looked around, confused. I remembered setting them just inside the door like I always did. I checked under the cot, checked outside. Nothing. Then I noticed something out near the lake, just barely visible from the front window. A single boot, sitting upright on the edge of the dock. I threw on my backup shoes and ran down to the water. There it was, my boot, dry, clean, standing perfectly straight at the end of the dock. No sign of the other one. It was like someone had taken it, walked down the dock, and just placed it there. I didn't stay calm. I screamed. I cursed. I ran back to the cabin and packed half my stuff, ready to drive out and find the nearest town. But I stopped myself. The trail back was rough, and the last stretch to the main road was nothing but dirt and potholes. I wasn't sure I could drive it without blowing a tire, especially since I hadn't seen a gas station in miles. And the thought of driving out into that forest alone, not knowing who or what was out there, made my skin crawl. I decided to give it one more night. I kept the axe beside my bed and lit 2 lanterns instead of 1. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat in the chair facing the door, the axe across my lap, heart thudding. Around 2 a.m., I heard footsteps. Not animal sounds, human, careful, deliberate, crunching softly in the leaves around the back of the cabin. Then silence. I held my breath. The back window was too high to see from the cot, so I stood up slow, trying not to make a sound. I stepped to the stove and looked through the back window. I swear I saw the shape of a man standing at the edge of the woods, just tall enough that the moonlight caught his shoulders and part of his face. But he wasn't looking at the cabin. He was looking at the outhouse, just staring. Then, without moving his head, he raised one arm and pointed at it. I blinked, looked again, and he was gone. I don't remember falling asleep, but I must have passed out from exhaustion near dawn, still gripping the axe. When I woke up, there was something written on the side of the outhouse in mud, or maybe shit, I don't know. Just one word: stay. I packed everything: food, bedding, everything I could carry. I didn't care if I ruined my suspension. I got in the truck and drove straight down the trail, bouncing over rocks and branches. I didn't stop until I hit pavement. 3 hours later, I rolled into a diner off Highway 53, dead-eyed and shaking. I told the cook I'd been camping and saw something weird. He just nodded and said, "Larch pines'll do that to you." I didn't ask what he meant. I got a motel room, showered, slept for 10 hours straight. The next day, I called the number Robert B. had given me, disconnected. I drove home the following week. I never reported it. I don't think I could have explained it if I tried. There were no crimes, no threats, just something wrong. A man, maybe, a person who lived in those woods and didn't want to be found. I looked up larch pines a few months later. Couldn't find it on any map. Probably a nickname. But I did find an old forum post from 2007 with a photo of a red canoe on a dock and a caption underneath. Asterisk, if you go, don't look in the trees after dark. Just stay inside. Asterisk. I never went back. I kept the boot. Found the other one in my truck weeks later, stuffed behind the seat. I don't remember putting it there, but I don't forget that man. The way he pointed. He wasn't threatening me. Not exactly. He was warning me, and I listened. I didn't tell anyone where I was going. That wasn't out of recklessness or pride. It was just habit. I didn't have anyone to tell. My phone had been dead for weeks. I hadn't paid the bill since early October. I didn't really care. The only texts I ever got were from my bank, and I already knew what they'd say. I was 39 that fall, working warehouse shifts in Spokane, if you could call it working. Hours were drying up. I knew what that meant, so I started looking west toward the mountains, toward that open air. I remembered a cabin my uncle used to talk about, a place he and my aunt had rented for 2 months every year, a speck in the trees near Troy, Montana. He'd passed 6 years ago. I hadn't seen her in almost 3. I'd remembered it as peaceful when I'd visited once, back when I was 20 or so. The cabin sat about 45 minutes up a winding gravel road, deep in the forest, past all cell service, past mailboxes and turnoffs and road signs. I didn't remember exactly where it was, but I figured if I drove long enough up the mountain, I'd know it when I saw it. I figured if I made it there and stayed for a while, maybe things would slow down for me too. Maybe I'd just feel something again. I left Spokane with a full tank, a small cooler with some lunch meat and beer, a heavy-duty sleeping bag, and a .22 rifle I'd bought years ago at a pawn shop. I didn't plan on using it, but I figured you didn't go into the woods in Montana without something. It was late October, and the weather had already started to bite at night. I threw a bundle of firewood in the back, found an old hand axe in my garage, and left everything else behind. I got to Troy by late afternoon. The sun was hanging low behind the hills. I filled up again just in case and drove up the main road that ran along Lake Creek, watching for that familiar turnoff. I didn't find it at first. I turned around twice. It was only on the third pass that I saw a barely visible path leading off the right side. There wasn't a name or number, Just an old bent gate pushed open against a tree, weeds growing over the dirt. I turned onto it. The road was rougher than I remembered. Fallen branches scraped under my tires, and deep ruts shook the wheel in my hands. I followed it up for what felt like an hour, the light fading fast behind me, the trees growing thicker until I could hardly see the sky. Then I saw it. The cabin was tucked away behind a small clearing, half covered in shadow. It looked smaller than I remembered, just a single story, one window, and a porch that sagged a little at one corner. There was a blue tarp draped over some firewood out back, and the old stone chimney rose above the roofline like a crooked finger. I parked the truck and sat for a few minutes, just watching it. No one had been here in years, but it hadn't fallen in. I grabbed my bag in the cooler and walked up the porch, testing each step before I put my full weight down. The door was unlocked, the key still nailed to the underside of the windowsill like I remembered. Inside, the air was cold and thick with dust. There was a cot in the corner with a rolled-up mattress, a stone fireplace, and a small wooden table pushed against the wall. The place smelled like pine and mildew, like something old trying not to be forgotten. I didn't do much that first night, just unrolled the mattress, built a fire, and sat in silence, listening to the wood crackle. I had no phone, no radio, no noise at all, just the forest breathing out there beyond the walls. The cold came in fast after the fire died. I curled into the sleeping bag, watching the flickering embers glow in the dark. I slept like a stone. The first few days were quiet, peaceful even. I chopped some wood. I walked the creek below the cabin. I sat on the porch in the morning with coffee from my thermos, watching deer pass through the trees. I didn't see another person. No cars, no footprints, no planes overhead. It was like the world had gone still, and I was the only one left to notice. On the fourth day, I found a trail I didn't remember. It started behind the cabin and cut straight into the trees. It wasn't marked, no tape, no signs, but it was worn enough to be visible, like something had walked it often. I followed it for maybe an hour, deeper than I'd ever gone before. The trees pressed close on both sides, and the underbrush grew thick. I started feeling uneasy, like I was being watched. I turned back. That night, the wind came in hard. It whipped through the trees and rattled the loose boards on the cabin. The fire wouldn't catch. I used almost half a bundle trying to keep it lit. I gave up after midnight and pulled the sleeping bag tighter around me. I heard something outside around 3 a.m., not an animal. Heavier, slower. I stayed still, not even breathing, until it passed. In the morning, I checked the dirt near the steps. No prints, but the tarp had come loose and half the firewood was gone. I figured it had been the wind. Maybe a bear, though I hadn't seen any sign of one. I reinforced the tarp and kept the rifle closer that night. 2 days later, I found the prints. They weren't boots. They weren't paws. They were bare feet, human, wide and flat, with toes spread apart like a child's drawing. There were 3 of them, maybe 30 feet from the back door, leading off toward the creek. They were fresh. I could see the outline where the heel had sunk a little deeper into the mud. It was freezing out. No one should have been barefoot. I followed them a little ways, but they disappeared into the rocks. I circled the area, looking for more, but nothing. Just those 3 facing the cabin. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, I packed up, threw everything into the truck bed and turned the engine. It didn't start. I tried again. Nothing. The battery was dead. I checked under the hood, even though I didn't know what I was looking for. No wires were cut. No damage. Just dead. I sat in the driver's seat for a while, staring out at the trees. I told myself it was the cold. Maybe I'd left a dome light on. Maybe the battery was old. I hadn't driven it much before the trip. Still, I couldn't shake that feeling in my chest, like something was closing in. I stayed another night, fire burning high, rifle across my lap. That night, I heard the footsteps. Not loud, not fast, just slow crunching in the leaves, circling the cabin. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. I just watched the door and waited. They came and went, never closer than maybe 20 feet. No knocks, no voice, just a slow loop around the cabin over and over, for hours. When daylight finally came, I stepped outside. The leaves had been disturbed in a perfect ring around the place. Not a path, just an outline, like someone had walked around and around all night long, never stopping. That was the day I stopped pretending I was alone. I started making a plan. I couldn't hike all the way back to Troy, too far, and I didn't know the way without the road. The gas station was nearly 50 miles. I could try following the creek, but it wound through miles of dense forest. I spent the day trying to fix the truck, cleaned the terminals, tapped the starter. Nothing worked. The air smelled heavy, like metal and pine and something else I couldn't place. I went to sleep early, fire high again, rifle loaded. That night, I didn't hear anything. No footsteps, no wind, just silence. When I woke up, the door was wide open. I'd locked it. I remembered locking it. Nothing was missing. Not the rifle, not my bag, just the door open like an invitation. I closed it and jammed a chair under the handle. The next night, I pushed the table in front of it too. The footsteps came back. I stayed awake all night, eyes on the door, heart pounding like a drum in my chest. In the morning, the door was still closed, but there was a new set of prints. Smaller, closer, right at the porch steps. I was losing my mind. I knew it. The isolation, the cold, the silence. It was all getting to me. I started keeping a journal, just to prove I wasn't imagining things. I wrote everything down. Times, sounds, tracks. Each night I added more. Circles in the dirt, scratches on the window. Once, a small pile of stones stacked just outside the door, like someone marking time. By the second week, I was running low on food. The meat was gone. I had a few cans of beans left and some stale crackers. I tried fishing the creek but caught nothing. I fired the .22 once at a rabbit but missed. I knew I couldn't last much longer. That night, I didn't hear footsteps. I heard breathing, right outside the window. Not loud, just steady, slow, like someone standing still, watching. I held the rifle against my chest and didn't move. My eyes were fixed on the dark shape behind the glass. A silhouette, not moving, just there. Stayed until dawn. When the light hit, it was gone. But the window had a single handprint on it, wide and flat, no gloves. That was when I knew I had to leave one way or another. I packed what I could into a backpack, filled 2 bottles with creek water, took the rifle and the last can of beans. I left